very good. All right. So the Kalam argument is related to the Christian view of divine revelation. And as I think you all would know that according to the scripture, the Bible, God revealed himself in two ways. One is through the general revelation, which is through his revelation through creation, right? Through what he has made. And Romans chapter 1 verse 20 says that we can know that God exists, right, by his creation, because since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his divine power and eternal and his power and divine nature has been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. And Acts chapter 14 verse 17 says that God has left behind witnesses in the natural world, right, so that people can know that he exists based on all these witnesses. So in some ways, this is similar to how scientists can know that atoms exist, for example, even though we cannot see atoms directly, even though we cannot see the constituents of atoms like quantum particles, but we can know that these things exist based on the effects they cause, right? Based on the phenomena which they cause, we can infer that there must be something there, even though we cannot see it. So likewise, based on our observation of the universe, we can infer that there must be a creator of the universe. And these ways of inference is formulated in terms of the arguments of natural theology, of which the Kalam cosmological argument is one of them. Right? And there are actually a number of arguments other than Kalam. There's also the fine-tuning argument, which I'm sure Professor Kwan will talk about later on. The argument for a designer. And again, there are various forms of that. And, we can also infer that there is a designer of the universe based on the laws of nature, the fine-tuning of the Big Bang. And we can infer that there is a moral lawgiver as well from the laws of morality, which we are aware of. So these and other arguments are some examples of the arguments of natural theology, right? Which is a way to understand God's general revelation and to know that there is a creator. There's a God who created the universe and who is a moral lawgiver. Now, the Bible also speaks about special revelation, which is God's revelation in history. And here we have evidence for Jesus, his claims, and his resurrection. Right? So Jesus claimed to be divine, and his resurrection is evidence that he is of his claims that he is truly divine. And I'll be talking about that at the last part of today's conference. And there is also other evidences for the Bible being a revelation of God in history. So evidence from fulfilled prophecies, etc. Okay, so these are the arguments for special revelation. Now, just now, the introducer mentioned that we are facing a lot of challenges in the universities nowadays, right? Because many people in the universities, they are not, they are very secular, right? And theistic. There are many atheists, right, in the universities. However, what many people are not aware about is that these arguments, which I mentioned, are still being defended today in publications by leading academic publishers, right? So, such as the Oxford University Press and Wiley Blackwell, Cambridge University Press, Springer Nature, right? So here I list down a number of these high-quality academic resources, which shows that all these arguments which I mentioned are still being taken very seriously today. And this is one of the best kept secrets, right, in a secular university, because a lot of professors won't mention this, right? But if you look into the libraries, if you look into your library, you'll find that actually these books are available in the library, actually, right? And you can download many of them in the library, from the libraries as well, right? So these arguments, these books which are listed here will provide very vigorous defense of these arguments. And I've published a number of them myself. Just now, Dominic mentioned that I have a book called God and Ultimate Origins, which is published by Springer. And I'll be sharing the contents of this book mostly for my talk. But you can check out these other books as well, which also talks about the Kalam and also other arguments which I mentioned. Okay, so let me say something about the significance of the Kalam cosmological argument. Why is it so important? Well, first of all, it proves the existence of a creator God, right? So it is consistent with general revelation. Now, by itself, it does not prove that this God is the God of Christianity. Right? So this will require the arguments of special revelation. Right? So this argument doesn't prove the Trinity. It doesn't prove that the God, the creator, is God the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. No, the Kalam argument doesn't prove that, right? It only proves that there is a creator, right? So in order to prove the Trinity, to prove that Jesus is divine, right, you need other arguments, right? You need the arguments of special revelation, which I will talk about in the last talk for today, right? So I will talk about the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection, right, during the last session today. So by itself, the Kalam doesn't prove that the God who created the universe is the God of Christianity. However, the Kalam argument can be used in combination with other arguments, right? So you can use the Kalam and combine it with the resurrection argument, for example, and this will give you the God of Christianity, right? So you can combine all these arguments together. So by itself, it doesn't prove that the God who created the universe is the God of Christianity. Nevertheless, by itself, it is already sufficient to refute naturalism, atheism, agnosticism, Buddhism, Taoism, and pantheism. Right, and so this is a very significant result, right? Because we know that naturalism, atheism, agnosticism is widespread in the Western academia today, right? And also in the universities around the world, right? These are very widespread worldviews. Now, the Kalam argument by itself is already sufficient to refute all this, okay? It proves that there is a creator God, right? So you cannot be an atheist, you cannot be agnostic, or naturalist, right? Given the argument. And also Buddhism, Taoism, pantheism is very prevalent in the East, right? So in India, I understand that pantheism, for example, right, is quite prevalent in Indian religious and philosophical thought. So the Kalam argument is already sufficient to refute this, and also Buddhism and Taoism, which is quite prevalent in Chinese philosophical and religious thought, right? So this Kalam argument by itself, right, is already very significant, right? And we can use it in combination with other arguments, such as the arguments for the resurrection of Jesus, which I mentioned earlier on. So the Kalam argument is very important. Okay, so let me now explain. Now, the argument has a long history. It can be traced all the way back to John Peloponnesus, all the way in the 6th century AD. He was a Christian philosopher and a scientist based in Alexandria in Egypt. And he formulated arguments against Aristotle. He proved that there is a beginning of time, actually. And these arguments were later developed by Islamic scholars, and that's why it is known as the Kalam, right? Which is the Arabic name for the word of God. And this argument has been enhanced by contemporary Big Bang cosmology, okay, which I will talk about later on as well. Okay. So the Kalam argument is an a posteriori argument. Now, what does it mean? It means that it is an argument that starts with observation, right? And it starts with the observation of the universe, of the stars and galaxies, and deduce that there is a creator of all these things, right? So it is very important to note this. That is an a posteriori argument, right? Because a lot of people have misunderstanding about the Kalam argument. A lot of people have misunderstanding about the cosmological argument. They think that the cosmological argument is guilty of defining God into existence. Okay. Now this is wrong, right? The Kalam argument does not define God into existence, right? Rather, it deduces God's existence based on what we observe, right? So it is very scientific in that sense, right? So it starts with observation. You observe the stars, galaxies, and ask, where did all this come from, right? Now, this is one of the biggest questions that humans have asked, right? I'm sure some of you will have thought about this question as well, right? When you look into the night sky, when you observe the stars and galaxies, I'm sure some of you will have asked the question, right? Where did all this come from, right? This beautiful cosmos, right? Where did they come from? Now, contemporary science, cosmology, has discovered the evidence that our universe, our space-time dimension, had a beginning at the Big Bang, right? And this was contrary to what many scientists thought all the way back in the 19th century. So prior to the discovery of the evidence for the Big Bang, most scientists in the 19th century thought that our universe is eternal, is always as it is. But in the early 20th century, with the development of the theory of relativity, right, by Einstein, and when Einstein applied his theory of relativity on the cosmos, he realized that the universe is not stable; it's either expanding or collapsing, right? And later on, other scientists, such as Edwin Hubble, he discovered evidence that the distances between the galaxies are actually increasing, right? And so this indicates that our universe is indeed expanding. And after that, and since then, more evidence have been discovered, right, to show that our universe is indeed expanding. And if our universe is expanding, what this means is that if you go back in time into the past, right, so 1,000 years ago, our universe would have been smaller. 5,000 years ago, it would have been even smaller. So if you go back all the way, you'll find that our universe had a beginning, right, at an explosive, expansive beginning, right? It expanded, right? It expanded from something very, very small, right? And which scientists call the singularity, right? So it has an explosive beginning at the Big Bang, and the evidence for the explosion has also been described in the form of the cosmic microwave background radiation, the radiation that was left behind, right, by the explosion, right, has been discovered as well. So all this fits together, right, to show that, to indicate that our universe did have an explosive beginning. So our universe did begin to exist, right? Now, since our universe since our universe did begin to exist, what this means is that our universe would have a cause, right? Because something cannot come from nothing, right? So if our universe began to exist, something must have caused its beginning, right? And so this result is consistent with the Kalam cosmological argument, which shows that our universe, that time, has a beginning as well, right? And that our universe was brought into existence by a cause. Something caused the beginning of the universe, and the cause is God, right? I will explain this later on. Now, in addition to the scientific evidence for the beginning of our universe, we also have philosophical arguments to prove that time has a beginning. And as I mentioned just now, some of these arguments were actually formulated by John Philoponus himself, right? In particular, the second one, the impossibility to traverse an actual infinite. Now, in addition to this argument, there are at least three other arguments to show that the past, that the time must have a beginning. And these arguments include the arguments against concrete actual infinities, the argument against infinite causal regress, which will be a dependence regress, and there are also various paradoxes, right, to prove that time cannot be infinite in the past, such as the Green River paradox, formulated by philosopher John Pras, and the Methuselah diary, formulated by another philosopher, Ben Walters. Now, only one of these arguments will be sufficient, right, to prove that time has a beginning. So you don't need all four, actually. And because of limitation of time, because we don't have infinite amount of time here today, right? So I shall only talk about one or two of these arguments, right? In fact, you only need one. Any one of them is enough to prove that time has a beginning. So let me talk very briefly about the second one. It is impossible to traverse an actual infinite. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, think about a series of events, right? A series of changes, something that happened one after another, right? So suppose event 1 begins at time t1, event 1 causes event 2, and event 2 causes event 3, for example, right? Now, the number of events can increase with time, right? So 1,000, they may have many, many events, right? The number of events can increase with time, but there can never be an actual infinite number of events at any time, because no matter how many events there are, the numbers of events is still finite. So if there are 1,000 events at time t1000, 1,000 events is 1,000 is still a finite number. If there are 100,000 events, right, at time t100,000, 100,000 is still a finite number. So what this shows is that an actual infinite has greater number than the number which can be traversed one after another. Right? So you can never arrive at an actual infinite by a one after another process, right? Because why? Because 1 + 1 = 2, 2 + 1 = 3, 3 + 1 = 4 is always finite. Right? So what this shows is that finite plus finite equals finite, right? A finite number add to a finite number is a finite number, right? So finite plus finite equals finite. So you can never traverse an actual infinite. Right? You can never arrive at the actual infinite via, you can never accumulate, or you can never constitute an actual infinite through a one after another process, because finite plus finite equals finite. Now, since it is impossible to traverse an actual infinite of number of later events from event 1, it is likewise impossible to traverse an actual infinite number of events of earlier events to event 1, given that the number of events required to traverse in both cases is the same, right? So you can never constitute an actual infinite by starting from a point. Likewise, you can never constitute actual infinite right, from the past, right, to arrive at a point. Right? So what this shows is that the number of events, the number of earlier events, right, must be finite. Right? So the number of causes, number of durations cannot be an actual infinite. So what this means is that there must be a first event and also a first cause. Right? The number of earlier events cannot be actually infinite. So what this shows is that time has a beginning, right? The number of events in the past cannot be actually infinite. There must be a first event and the first cause. Okay, so this is the one argument to prove that time has a beginning, that there must be a first cause. Now there's another argument which I can explain very briefly, and this is the argument against infinite causal regress. And I think this one is very simple and easy to understand. So if you explain to other people, you can use this illustration, right? Now, so let's think about a series of train cars, right? A series of train cars, and suppose they are not moving initially, right? So before the last train car can begin to move, the one before it has to begin to move, right? In order to pull it along, right? So that the last train car can begin to move. However, before the one before it begin to move, the one before it has to begin to move, right? In order to pull the ones behind it along. Right? Now, if that is all there is, then obviously, I mean, no train car would ever begin to move, right? Because they're all stationary and because none of them has the capacity to move by itself, right? So all of them need to depend on the one before it, right, in order to begin to move. So if there is all there is, then none of these train cars will ever begin to move. So in order for them to begin to move, what is required is an engine, right? A first puller, a first engine, something that has the capacity to, something that has the independent capacity to begin movement, something that doesn't require another thing to pull it along, right? So the first puller will be an independent source of beginning. It has independent in the sense that it doesn't depend on other things to put it along, right? And it has the capacity to begin pulling others along. Okay, and so this indicates that there must be a first puller, right? So likewise, we can show that there must be a first cause of time as well. Why? Because before I begin to exist, right? Before I begin to exist, my parents have to begin to exist first. And before they begin to exist, their parents, my grandparents, have to begin to exist, right? So if that is all there is, then none of us will begin to exist. Why? Because each of us is dependent on the one before, right, in order to begin to exist, right? So if there is all there is, then none of us would ever begin to exist. So what is required is there must be a first cause. There must be a first cause which is independent. Independent in the sense that the first cause will not require another cause to bring it into existence, right? So there must be an independent, uncaused first cause, right? And such a first cause must exist in order that the universe will begin to exist, in order that my parents will begin to exist, in order that I will begin to exist, right? So I hope this is clear to all of you. I hope this is obvious, right? So this argument proves that there must be an uncaused, independent, existing first cause. Okay. All right. So I already explained all this just now. I can go through this very fast. Okay. So there must be an independently existing and beginningless first cause. Right. Why must it be beginningless? Because everything that begins to exist must have a cause. So since the first cause is uncaused, it must be without beginning. All right. I will explain this point more later on. Now, sometimes people wonder whether the first cause, whether can it be avoided by a causal loop? So could it be that time is like a circle? Can we avoid a first cause in a circular time? Now, this will not work. Why? Because first of all, it is contrary to the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics indicates that the entropy is increasing, right? So which means that things are getting more and more disordered, right? And so if it was a circle, then what this means is that entropy will increase, and then it has to revert back to low entropy again, right? And that is contrary to the second law of thermodynamics. So it is contrary to science. And moreover, there's also a philosophical problem with such a loop as well, because a loop, a circle, in which A requires B to bring it into existence, B requires C to bring it into existence, and C requires A to bring it into existence. I mean, this is viciously secular, right? It's like saying that the train car A requires B to bring it into motion, B requires C to bring it into motion, and C requires A to bring it into motion. Right? Obviously, none of them will begin to move, right? If it's a circle like that, right? And so this is viciously circular. So this will not work. It's like saying that I came from my parents came from my grandparents, and my grandparents came from me, right? So this is absurd, and so such a circle would not work. And therefore, a circular time cannot be a case. So what this means is that time must be linear, right? It cannot be circular. It cannot be the case that the beginning and the end are joined together like a circle. It cannot be the case. So what this means is that they are not joined together. They must be separate. And so what this means is that time must be linear. And what this means is that there must be a beginning, right? There must be a first cause at the beginning. All right. So I have shown that, that there must be a first cause. So what is this first cause? Right. Now, first of all, since the first cause is the first, it must be uncaused, right? As I already explained earlier on, there cannot be an infinite regress, right? So there must be a first cause. And this first cause must be uncaused. And secondly, since everything that begins to exist has a cause, and the first cause is uncaused, the first cause must be without beginning. I already explained earlier on that everything begins to exist must have a cause. Why? Because something cannot come from nothing. Right? So if something begins to exist, it must be brought into existence by something else. However, if something is without beginning, then it has always existed, right? And such a thing which has always existed without a beginning is not brought into existence. It's not brought into existence by something else because it has always existed, right? So such a thing can be a first cause, right? And so the first cause must be without beginning. Now, in chapter 5 of my book, I explain other arguments to prove that everything that begins to exist has a cause, right? So other than the fact that something cannot come from nothing, we can also give other arguments to prove that everything that begins to exist must have a cause. And one of the proofs goes like this. If something X begin uncaused, then some other particular things or events, such as Y, which begin to exist, would also begin uncaused. Now, why? Because firstly, there will not be any cause, which makes it the case that only X rather than Y begin uncaused. Secondly, the properties of X and the properties of Y, which differentiate between them, would be had by them only when they already began to exist. And thirdly, the circumstances is compatible with the beginning of Y. Now, I will explain this later on, right? But let me lay out the argument first, right? So the argument is that if something began to exist uncaused, if this were the case, then other things would also begin uncaused. But that is not the case, right? We don't see other things beginning to exist uncaused, right? So for example, we don't see a tiger or a lion suddenly beginning uncaused in front of us, right? I mean, you don't have to worry that a dinosaur will suddenly begin to exist uncaused and drop onto your head, right? That doesn't happen, right? And therefore, we can conclude that it is not the case that something began uncaused, right? So what this proves is that our universe could not have begun to exist uncaused, right? Since our universe has a beginning, it must have a cause, right? Something does not begin to exist uncaused, right? So this proves that everything that begins to exist has a cause, right? And this is very easy to understand, right? So let me illustrate with another analogy. Now, so suppose that let's think about this, right? A sperm and an egg. Where do I come from, right? I came from my father's sperm and my mother's egg, right? So when the sperm and the egg, when they joined together, it brought me into existence. So I did not begin to exist uncaused, right? I began to exist because my father's sperm and my mother's egg brought me into existence, right? Now, suppose I begin to exist uncaused, right? So now we may ask this question: what makes it the case that it was I which began to exist? Right? Why not a tiger or a dinosaur? Right? Why is it the case that when my father's sperm and my mother's egg, why is it the case that when they join together, it forms a human being like me, and not a tiger or a lion or a dinosaur? Why? Because the properties of the cause determines the effect. Right? The properties of the cause determines the effect. Now, if something begin to exist uncaused, what this means is that there will be no cause whatsoever. There will be nothing that determines the effect. Right? And so what this means is that any kind of effects would happen as well, right? There'll be no control over what began to exist. And so if something began to exist uncaused, we will see all kinds of things beginning to exist uncaused. But that is not the case, right? We don't see a tiger or a lion or a dinosaur suddenly begin to exist uncaused in front of us. So what this proves is that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Okay, so this is the proof for the causal principle. Now, I already explained that the first cause must be uncaused, and the first cause must be without beginning, right? And thirdly, now since I already also explained earlier on that there cannot be an infinite regress of events, right? And by an event, I mean a change, right? There cannot be an infinite regress of changes. So since the first change, the first event, could not have begun to exist uncaused, right? Now, an event is something that has a beginning, right? So a change is something that has a beginning. Now, and I already shown that there must be a first event, right? Since the first event cannot begin uncaused, the first event must have been caused by a first cause which was initially changeless and timeless, right? And so we need to ask, right? So I already explained, right? There must be a first event, a first change. The first change cannot be brought about by another change, right? Since the first change is the first, right? And so the first change must have been brought about by something else which was changeless, right? Initially changeless, right? Initially without change. And so we need to ask, how did so we can think about something that is initially not changing, right? Initially not moving, for example. And we want to ask, so how can something which is initially changeless, how did that begin? How did that begin to change? How did that begin the first change? How did that brought about the first change? Right. Now, in order to bring about the first change, the first event from an initially changeless state, the first cause must have, firstly, the capacity to be the originator of the first event in a way that is undetermined by prior events, since the first cause is the first. Right? So the first cause must have the capacity to bring about the first event by itself. And secondly, the first cause must also have the capacity to prevent itself from changing initially. For otherwise, the first cause will not have been initially changeless. Right? So the first cause must have the capacity to prevent itself from causing the first change. Right? It can hold back, right, from causing the first change. And it also has the capacity to bring about the first change by itself. Right? And so this ability to hold back and to bring about by itself, this describes what philosophers call libertarian freedom. Right, so the first cause must be free, right? So what this means is that the first cause must be able to freely bring about the first event, right? To bring about the first change from an initially changeless state. Right? So what this means is that the first cause must have this kind of freedom, which is characteristic of person, right? It must have free will in a sense, right? It must be a person. Okay, so this shows that the first cause must be a personal creator. Right? Only a person, right, can explain how the first event could have begun to exist, right, from an initially changeless and timeless state. So what this shows is that the first event, the way the first cause caused the first event is not a mechanistic causation. It's not like a kind of mechanism, right, which does not have freedom. Right? Something that is mechanic, something that moves in a mechanistic way that will not have freedom. So it is not a mechanistic causation, it's a libertarian freedom, it's a free causation, right? And secondly, it is not a physical entity, it is not a random causation, it's not a random physical cause. Because random physical causes are constantly changing. Whereas in this case, we have a first cause that is initially changeless, that is without change, right? So it is not a random event, it is not a physical event, it is something that is non-physical, right? It is something that is immaterial. So what this shows is that it cannot be something physical because physical things are constantly changing. Physical things change according to laws, according to physical laws. Whereas this first cause is not constantly changing, it is initially changeless. And it also has freedom, it has free will. So it is not a physical thing, it's a non-physical thing, it's a non-physical thing with free will. Right? So it's a non-physical person. Right? So the first cause must be a non-physical person. And so this refutes atheism and pantheism, right? And fifthly, the first cause must be highly intelligent as well, right? In order to bring about a universe with its amazing laws of nature, which I'm sure Professor Kwan will talk about later on, right? The argument for a designer, the first cause must be highly intelligent, right? It must be a superior mind. It must be a mind. In the words of Albert Einstein, right? It must be a mind that brought about a universe with such a high degree of order, which we observe, which we study using science, which science discover, right? So science discovered these amazing laws of nature, right? And all these must have come from a first cause, which is highly intelligent to bring about a universe with all these amazing laws of nature. And sixthly, in order to bring about the entire universe, the first cause must be enormously powerful, right? To bring about the billions and billions of galaxies and the billions and billions of stars which we observe. So the first cause must be incredibly, tremendously powerful to bring about the entire universe. So what we have here is that there must be a first cause. So if you ask the question, where did the universe come from, right? So the universe must have come from a first cause, which is uncaused, without beginning, initially changeless and timeless, has freedom, intelligence, and enormously powerful. Such a first cause must be a creator, right, of the universe. And so there must be a creator which brought about the entire universe. So this creator of the universe must exist. Okay, so this is the proof to show that our universe has a creator. Right? And this creator deserves our worship, right? So we should worship this creator and give thanks, right, to this creator of the universe. All right, so understanding the cosmological argument can help us answer a lot of questions which atheists have. So for example, a very popular question which a lot of people would ask is, where did God come from, right? So if you say that our universe came from God, then where did God come from? And Richard Dawkins, a very well-known atheist, he asked the question, who made God, right? So if you say the universe was made by God, then who made God? Now, this question assumes that everything has a cause. So it assumes that if the universe has a cause, which is God, then God must also have a cause. But this assumption is false. Right? It is not true. It is not true that everything has a cause. Rather, what is true is that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Right? Why? Because I already explained earlier on, right? Something cannot come from nothing, right? And if something comes from nothing, then other things will also begin to exist uncaused, which is not the case, right? So only things which begins to exist requires a cause. However, if something is without a beginning, then this means that it has always existed and therefore was not brought into existence, right? It has always been there. So such a thing did not come from anything. It didn't come from nothing. It didn't come from anything. It has always existed. It has always been there. And so such a thing can be uncaused. Nothing made it. So the cosmological argument shows that there must be such a first cause, right, which is uncaused and without beginning, and that this first cause is the creator, right? So this proves that there must be an uncaused creator who didn't come from anything, right? Rather, it is the source of everything else. It brought everything else into existence, right? So the cosmological argument proves that such a first cause exists. All right. So if you want to find out more, you can check out my book, God and Ultimate Origins. I think this book is available in your library if you work in the universities. If you're a college student or university professors, you will be able to download this book for free, actually. Otherwise, you can buy this book. It's available in paperback, right? So you can check out this book, which explains the cosmological argument in greater detail. All right. Okay, so that's all for my presentation. I shall stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Loke, for the very well formulated argument. And may I inform the audience that Dr. Loke is a primary expositor of the Kalam cosmological argument. In fact, it was promoted and in a way resurrected by William Lane Craig. And Dr. Loke's book, God and Ultimate Origins, tries to fix some of the perhaps loopholes in the arguments as such, and offers better arguments for the existence of God. So thank you very much, Dr. Loke. And if there are some questions, you can you can type in the chat box, and Dr. Loke would address that later on. And now we move to the next talk by Professor Kwan. Professor Kwan will present to us a case for intelligent design. Professor Kwan.
Hello, Dominic. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Not yet. You need to share it.
Okay. Can you see now?
Not yet, Professor Kwan.
I have pressed the share screen, but
Oh, so shall I help to share the screen?
let me try it for a minute more.
Mm-hmm. You need to click on share screen and then, yeah, can see now.
You can see now. Okay, good.
Not yet, but yeah, can see
Okay.
now. Can see now. Right. Thank you.
Okay, you can see now. Okay.
Yep. Mm.
Now, first of all, let me say hello to different brothers in the different brothers and sisters in different countries. We are from Hong Kong, and Andrew is now in Singapore, and many of you are in the very large the country of India. And when I see people from different countries, it makes me realize that the body of Christ is really a cross-cultural and international community. And then we also need to thank God for the new technology which makes this possible. I think this kind of conference would not be possible in the past, but now this kind of opportunity also opens up ways to share our resources. So I think it's also my honor to share my own views on these topics of apologetics with you. Now, Andrew Locke has just talked about the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, I think concerning apologetics, the key question for Christians is whether different worldviews can be proved, or which worldview is better supported by the evidence, maybe from our experiences or from science. Okay. Now, if there is a creator, and Andrew has tried to argue that this creator is also personal, but still, according to Christianity, the creator need to be all-wise, so very intelligent. Okay. Now, so what is evidences for intelligent design? That is, if the whole world comes from the intelligent creator, then it is a product of intelligent design and not chance or unintentional product. So are there any key evidences for the intelligent design? Okay, so let me look at this topic. Now, I think, first of all, we notice that this is indeed a wonderful world. It is a world full of beauty and vitality. Just look at the mountains and the lakes and the rainbow. So I think it is a natural question to raise whether all these come from accident or design. So that is a perennial question in philosophy. Now, and then when we look at different kinds of creatures or organisms, in fact, many of them are very beautiful. They possess stunning beauty. Say, this is a kind of jellyfish. You can see that it's a natural wonder. And in fact, it is swimming with rows of cilia. And now, cilia seems very simple. You just look at them from the outside. But if you look at them from the inside, that is, if you look at their molecular structures or the structural characteristics and the components, like the proteins with many also complexities, you will start to realize that, in fact, this creature is not only beautiful, but really complicated, and it possesses a kind of complexity which transcends, I think, even the current human feats of technology. Now, and then, of course, we have all heard about the design argument. And in the 18th century, there is a famous theologian and philosopher, William Paley. He has formulated the classical design argument. Sometimes we also call it the watch argument. It uses the analogy of a watch to the universe to argue that if a watch needs a watchmaker, then the world also needs a designer. Now, for many people, they may think that, oh, that is an old argument. Perhaps the modern advances in science have overturned all these arguments. So this is an old but also outdated argument. Is that correct? I do not think so. Now, in fact, in the current decades, for example, you can look at the cover story of this Newsweek, this issue of Newsweek. It is a secular magazine, Now, but still, the cover story talks about God. And then it talks in a apparently positive way. It says, science finds God. Now, in fact, in this issue, it talks about a lot of new advances in science, which in fact make people, even including scientists, think again, think we anew the question about God. And many of them come to think that science and faith may not conflict. And some of them may even think that many new scientific findings provide support for the belief in God. Now, I think the Big Bang Theory makes it possible or plausible to argue again that there is a creator from the beginning of the universe. But of course, Andrew wants to argue mainly from the philosophical grounds. But I think concerning the resurgence of this argument, I think the new scientific discovery or the new theory of the Big Bang has helped a lot now. But if the universe has begun from a Big Bang, a very hot Big Bang, then what happened next? Now, in fact, if we talk about intelligent design, we can get data from different realms. Now, many people think that intelligent design is only about biology and a debate between evolution and creation. Now, I think that certainly is a major part, but it's not all. In fact, now we have data which suggests that, in fact, intelligence may have a part in the formation of not only of organisms, but also the setting of the natural laws and the whole process of cosmic evolution. Now, in fact, that's not entirely new, because if we know about William Paley's book on natural theology, in fact, it is divided into 2 volumes. One volume collects evidence from biology, and the other volume collects evidence from astronomy. So, in fact, there is a old astrology. Now, but I think modern findings about the cosmic evolution process makes us realize that it is a fine-tuned universe. And it is fine-tuned for what? For the emergence of life, or maybe even the emergence of intelligence like us. Now, I do not have time to go into all the details. Today, I've only just 40 minutes. I think I can introduce to you, I think, the current debate and then the data from different areas which converge on suggesting that the source of the entire universe is indeed intelligent and not a blind force. Okay, now, but you can see that life could not exist at the beginning of the Big Bang because it was so hot. Not even the atoms and molecules have been formed, in fact, at that moment. Now, so for life to exist, we need a slow formation of the galaxies, the planets, and then maybe the formation of the elements, so on and so forth. So it is a very complicated process. And what is the meaning of fine-tuning? The meaning of fine-tuning is saying that this process, which allows life to emerge, is not guaranteed. And then, in fact, it is very improbable. That is, if any of the myriad conditions have changed just a little bit, say just by a few percent or 0.5%, then the entire process would come to a dead end. Maybe everything would become blind and lifeless, and there would not be life and certainly no intelligence. Now, so it seems that from the expansion rate of the Big Bang and also the constant which define the magnitude of the several forces of the universe, the scientists discovered that they are finely tuned to a very high precision rate, which seems to calibrate it to make sure that life can emerge. And this is called the phenomena of fine-tuning. And in fact, the discovery of this data do not come from religious people like the priests. They come from secular scientists. And when they discovered the fact that our universe is highly improbable. In fact, our universe, which contains life, is not to be expected, in fact. But the life did come around. So, in fact, it is a very tricky process, and it's finely tuned, and many scientists seem to feel that may lead to a very reasonable hypothesis of a creator. Now here I just briefly look at the 4 basic forces of the universe: the gravity, the electromagnetic force, the nuclear strong force, and the nuclear weak force. And then you can see in the second column, they have widely divergent magnitude. Some is very small, some is very large. But anyway, they have a common characteristic, that is, any slight deviation from that magnitude would not allow the emergence of life, and that is part of the fine-tuning. Now, for example, if the balance between expansion and gravity is not maintained, then the universe, after expanding for a while, may start to contract, and then all the mass of the universe comes to a very small space, and then a black hole will be formed, and then that will be the big crunch and the end of the cosmic process, and then nothing interesting would come out of that. So this kind of fine-tuning allow life not to end in this way. So that is part of the fine-tuning. There are many other data. So the question is, are all these phenomena of fine-tuning coincidences? Now, the famous physicist Roger Penrose argues that the chance to find the appropriate phase space which allows the later emergence of this orderly universe and the emergence of life, the chance is very small, which is around 10 to the power of 123. That is 10 to the power of 123 is the index of the exponential of 10. Now, so in fact, it points out that we cannot even write down this number with all the zeros, with all the size of the universe. We cannot write down this number, but the chance of finding this appropriate universe in the entire process, which makes life possible, which makes the orderly universe possible, is 1 over this very, very big number, which is in fact quite inconceivable. And then the Big Bang is like an explosion. Now sometimes beautiful things come from explosion, like the fireworks. Now, but can it be by chance? Do we expect beautiful fireworks like this in the picture by chance explosion? Not really. Now we just look at another example of explosion. This explosion happened in August 2015, 5 years ago, in Tianjin in China. Now you can see that there's fire explosion, but what came from the explosion? What happened after that? You can see that is the aftermath of the explosion. You can see that the outcome of the explosion is ruins and debris, chaotic, and nothing interesting come out of the explosion. So can you imagine that after the explosion, a complete new high-rise suddenly appears just because of the explosion? Now, even if it is imaginable, it is not believable. Now, so I think similar to the case is that having the Big Bang, then why an orderly universe happened after that, and then which is a very finely tuned universe which allows for the emergence of life. And a very good explanation is that everything is structured and calculated by God, which makes sure the magnitudes of the laws such that life would emerge in the long run. Now we look at another realm, the biological realm. Now there is the so-called intelligent design movement, which mainly talks about biology, and they tries to challenge the hegemony of the naturalistic evolution. Now, but first of all, I want to make clear that I do not regard intelligent design and evolution as such as mutually exclusive. Now, even among Christians, there are complicated debates about how Christians should will the process of evolution, whether it really happened or not. Now, I don't want to go into that question because now, according to my discussion of fine-tuning, I can accept both positions. That is, maybe there is a kind of progressive creation. God may have stepped in some moments of history, which brought about, say, the first existence of life, or maybe human beings, or whatever. Now, there is another position of the God-guided evolution, which is called the Theistic evolution. So maybe evolutions have happened, but it's not a blind process. Now, so for advocates of intelligent design, sometimes I just call it ID. ID people only need to argue against the naturalistic explanation of everything. So I think ID does not need to argue against all sorts of evolution. So the key point is whether the ultimate origin of this world comes from intelligence or just blind chance. Okay. Now, so we have just looked at one piece of the evidence, which is the evidence of fine-tuning. Now we look at the biological data, and in recent decades, I think one major scientist in the ID movement is called Michael Behe, and he has published a book called Darwin's Black Box, which is also the biochemical challenge to evolution. Now, so usually the creationists talk about the birds or many other intelligent phenomena of, say, the bees making the beef combs, etc. Now, but nowadays, biochemistry has developed to a great extent that we can look at the very small parts of a cell, and when we look at these tiny parts of the cell, we find that there exist many molecular machines. That is, they are just like our machines, sometimes even more intricate and more complex than our machines. But they are consisting of the molecules, the atoms, and so Michael Behe thinks that all this discovery, I think, throws new light on the debate between creation and evolution. And in fact, he does not reject evolution entirely. He accepts the parts of common descent, but he thinks that all this evidence from life, including these molecular machines, show that the ultimate origin of this evolutionary process is intelligent rather than blind. Now, so this is Michael Behe. He's now the professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University in America. And one of his major concepts is called irreducible complexity. And that is one major support for the idea of ID. Now, so when we find something which is complex and with specific function, we detect design. Now, so here the two keywords are complex and specific. So I'm going to talk a lot about specified complexity or specified complex information, etc. And for IT people, this is one of the key indicators of intelligent design. And the probability of naturally forming something which is highly complex and with specific function and purpose is extremely low. And in fact, there are numerous examples of such irreducibly complex parts, even the simplest form of life. Now, for example, we have talked about cilia, and in some bacteria called like E. coli, say in our intestines, they can be found in our intestines. Now, many other bacteria as well. Now, they possess something called the bacterial flagellum. Okay, just kind of hair protruding from their cell surface. Now, but here there's a structure, the diagram of the flagellum. Now, you can see that in fact it is consisting of different parts, nicely fit together. And when we look at the parts, we call it hook, filament, bushing, rotor, and stator, etc. Now, if you are from the engineering background, you know that these are terms for a motor. These are exactly the terms for the motors designed by human beings. And in fact, they're not just analogical. The bacterial flagellum is a small mechanical motor. Now, it is composed of around 40 proteins, and each protein is consisted of many amino acids. So even one protein is very complex, and the chance of forming one functional protein, I emphasize the word functional because not all proteins are functional. To be a functional protein, many conditions have to be satisfied. Now, so to form a functional protein by chance is already unlikely. So you have to form 40 of them, and then you have to fit them together in accordance with a good design plan, which allows it to be a functional motor. Now, so the flagellum, because the motor, it can spin around, and that helps the bacteria swimming in the water, etc. Now, so and then if you take away some parts, this flagellum would stop functioning. So it is very complex, and then this complexity, if you look at the core of this flagellum, if you just take away one part, maybe not all 40 proteins are like that, but there is a certain number, say 20 something. If you just take away one, this flagellum would start to unravel and cannot function. Now, so it is called irreducible complexity. That is, it is complex, but then if you reduce it a little bit, the function would disappear. Now, that would be much harder for evolution to hit on all these proteins to make sure it has a function, because only if it has a function, it can have a survival advantage, which helps to explain its success in this process of the struggle for survival. Now, so this concept of irreducible complexity is important. And if you look at this motor, it does not just function barely. In fact, some scientists call it the universe's most efficient machine. It's a kind of nanotechnology, in fact, exceeding our nanotechnology, because the flagellum possesses the power to self-assembly and repair. There's a water-cooled rotary engine. It's driven by proton motive force. There are two gears, forward and reverse. So if it is spinning forward, it can stop and then spinning backwards. It operates as 6,000 to 70,000 revolutions per minute, and it can reverse direction within 1/4 turn. It's hardwired to signal transduction system with short-term memory. Now, we can talk for all day. In fact, recently we discovered that the genes to manufacture this flagellum is also complex and irreducible system. So there is complexity on complexity. There is a IC on IC. IC means the irreducible complexity. So it's harder to explain how this can come about merely by a chance process. Now, this idea of IC, irreducible complexity, can be applied to many organs of organisms. Say the eye, I think many people have talked about that, so I don't belabor this point. And also our brain. Now, to have a functional brain, of course, is an advantage for survival, but to be functional is not easy. So it seems so easy to get a functional brain, so we all expect our children to be smart, and at least they should be normal. But sometimes problems occurred, and people have mental problems because of the brain and so on. Now, so in fact, in the brain, there are millions or maybe even trillions of connections, and these kind of connections cannot go wrong. So if the connections go wrong, then that may seriously affect the function of our brain. The question is, how can such a complex brain, how can so many connections be formed correctly, almost entirely? For most of us, this process seems to be automatic and easy, but when we look at the details, it is highly incredible. Now, so even for Richard Dawkins, a very staunch atheist, he has written a book called The Blind Watchmaker, which in fact is a critique of creation and a defense of naturalistic evolution. Now, even Dawkins recognized that biology is a study of complicated things that give the appearance of living, having been designed for a purpose. So even Dawkins, a staunch atheist, says that he could not imagine being an atheist at any time before 1859, when Darwin's, the picture is Darwin, Origin of Species was published. And Dawkins said only Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Now, but he argued that at Darwin's time, he did not know about the complexities of the cell and all the molecular machines. So the new discoveries of biology, in fact, made Darwin's theory, at least when they applied to the origin of the cell, these molecular machines, more and more incredible. The atheistic philosopher John Mackey agreed the reciprocal adjustments of structures and functions in myriads of different organs are indeed so delicate and complicated as to be initially surprising in the extreme, and not merely to invite but require a search for some further explanation. And then the hypothesis of design is at least one that we consider among others. Now, in short, the intricacy of biological structures naturally calls for the idea of design. This seems to be a reasonable inference, unless defeated by counter evidence. Now, and then, in fact, before the emergence of molecular machines, which form some parts of a living cell, a cell which can self-replicate, we need to talk about the problem of the origin of life. Now, so according to the popular theory of chemical evolution, in a primordial atmosphere, there are methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water vapor, and due to the thunders and lightnings or the cosmic rays, etc., these molecules interact with one another, and they form the amino acids. These amino acids fall onto the surface of the sea, and they form an organic soup, or primeval organic soup. These molecules then collide with one another, and then they form the longer chains of amino acids, and finally proteins, and so on and so forth. So by this process of chemical evolution, life, the first life, can emerge from entirely non-life, these organic, these chemicals, etc. Now, so the chemical evolution believes that the cell, there's a plant cell here and an animal cell here. The cell is the simplest unit of life now, but we need to point out that it is much more complicated than the most advanced factory on Earth. Now, and then the origin of life, in fact, is a very difficult problem, even for naturalistic scientists. First of all, for life to exist, we need the genetic code, the basic information to guide the process of life. Now, so but to enable the life processes, we need proteins which serve the purposes of both construction and enzymes, and like the catalyst for the needed reactions in our body. Now, maybe in the origin, the first cell is simpler than the cells we see nowadays, but still, according to the estimation of many scientists, the smallest conceivable living cell must have at least 350 protein parts. Now, I have already pointed out that proteins are very complicated. They do not come about by themselves. Now, so in fact, in our body, proteins are manufactured according to the instructions of the DNA. Now, but for DNA to form, DNA also needs proteins for construction and as enzymes. Now, so you can see that it's like the paradox of the chicken and egg, which come first. Now, to form DNA, we need to have proteins. To form proteins, we need the instructions of DNA. Now, so it seems that both of them, and then they need to come to exist together at the same time, and then at that time, they should already be highly coordinated. Now, for example, to construct a protein, we need elaborate genetic code for different amino acids, etc. Now, so it is quite incredible. In fact, not many scientists can believe that this entire system can emerge by chance. Now, so this is a difficult problem. Now, of course, I know they talk about the RNA world, etc., but today I cannot go into all the details because any problem is so complicated. Now, so you can see that the most crucial problem for the source of for the origin of life is the source of information, the genetic code, the DNA, which contains a lot of information. Now, and then even Francis Crick says, by information, I mean the specification of the amino acid sequence in a protein. Information means here the precise determination of sequence, either of bases in the nucleic acid or an amino acid residues in a protein. And then it's much like a computer program. Now, so the problem of the origin of life is clearly basically equivalent to the problem of the origin of biological information. And to the big question mark is what is the origin of all these DNA and they contain the information. And then the experiences tell us information comes from intelligence. Now, of course, that is a very short inference. Now, to look at the problem in the details, we need a lot of discussions. I can recommend one of the key ID people who is called Stephen Meyer, who is the director of the Discovery Institute in Seattle, in America. He has written 2 books, which are highly academic and informational. One is called The Signature in the Cell, Stephen Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R. They are very readable. I think Meyer is a very good writer, and he is also a good researcher. Now, for example, concerning the origin of DNA, Meyer has looked at many naturalistic explanations and hypotheses, and point out that they are all unconvincing, and in fact, they are all suffering from fatal problems. Now, so according to the logic of the inference from the best explanation, I do agree that concerning the origin of the DNA, intelligence seems to be the best explanation and the most reasonable hypothesis. And then, in fact, the DNA is just one problem. Information is just one problem. To form a functional cell, we need a system for self-replication, energy transformer program to build a self-replicating energy transformer, decoder to read and run the program. Now, all these are very complicated structures in a cell nowadays. So, in fact, it is quite inconceivable that the first life could appear by chance. Now, I have talked about the current theory of chemical evolution. Now, but the naturalists suggest that this theory of chemical evolution is supported by the Meyer-Urey experiment. I mentioned that is by the chance combination of chemicals like methane, ammonia, and water vapor, etc. Amino acids can be formed, and then they can form proteins and so on. Now, in fact, some simple organic compounds can be formed, but first of all, the whole theory founders by the new discovery that the primordial atmosphere is more likely to be reducing, to be oxidizing atmosphere, because the theory requires a reducing atmosphere. Otherwise, the newly formed amino acids will soon be decomposed. Now, but the new discovery, looking at the rocks in very early times, scientists believe that the primordial atmosphere is more likely to be reducing, and that means this entire theory of chemical evolution cannot work. And then in this setup of the Meyer experiment, they use a trap And that is, now in fact that should be a kind of a simulation of a chance process, but the use of a trap is highly intelligent. So this entire setup is not really analogical to a transformation of compounds, and then the chemicals formed by this experiment is a waste-make mixture. Now, waste-make mixture means that in fact now organic molecules, in fact, they have a 3D structure. They have a mirror. They have a mirror counterpart. One form of a amino acid can have a mirror counterpart, and we call it the L form and the D form. Now, for organisms, they only use one form. They cannot have a mixture of L and D forms. But in fact, all the chemicals formed in this experiment are waste-make mixture, and they cannot be used by organisms. Now, so that is the illustration of the L and D form. So, but for life to use all these products from the random formation, they need just one form, but the actual products are the waste-make mixture of two forms. So that does not work. Now, so the entire process shows that it is very unlikely. The probability of random formation of first cell is, according to a famous astronomer Fred Hoyle, is 1 over 10 to the power of 40,000. Now, this figure comes from a physicist, and some biologists disagree, but if we look at other estimations, still, Hoyle's famous analogy seems to be very convincing. He says, if we expect this transformation of first cell to happen, it's like expecting the emergence of a new aircraft, like the Boeing 747 after a tornado hitting a junkyard of metal parts, which is effectively impossible. Even if it is logically possible, it is unreasonable to believe. Now, so if we do a new calculation based on our understanding of these amino acids, etc., or the proteins, in fact, I think the result is the same. The probability is incredibly small, and it is not reasonable to believe that chance can overcome this, even given the entire history and the volume of the universe. Now, in fact, I have many data, but time is short. I cannot go through all of them, but I expect one counter-argument. They say that the DNA is not so wonderful because now we have all those junk DNA, which seems to be a leftover of the trans-evolutionary processes in the past. Now, but in fact, usually what they call the junk DNA are the long protein coding regions. So this part of DNA do not seem to produce proteins. Now, but it is a false assumption to infer from this to the fact that they are non-functional. Now, in fact, according to new research like the ENCODE Encyclopedia of DNA Elements, this ENCODE project shows that 80% of the human genome, in fact, may have functions, and some DNA do not produce proteins as such, but they're like an operating system in a computer. It is used for the regulation of the functioning of other DNA. Now, if I have time, I will go on to talk about the logic of design detection. So I can only now recommend you to read the books by William Dembski, who is a mathematician. For example, this book, The Design Influence, is published by Cambridge University Press, and he uses the idea of specified complexity. Now, time forbids, but anyway, the idea is that the design detection is in fact common and possible, and they all seem to use this criterion of specified complexity. So if you look at the phenomena I've mentioned, they all exhibit this characteristic of specified complexity. So I think follows sound methodology to argue that these products also come from intelligence. Now, in fact, like I give you many examples of this, and then in the later part, I talk about other data. Just give me 2 more minutes. I go to the end of the PowerPoints. I need to skip all the data. Now, I just want to mention the idea that now there are complicated debates in each area, but I think nowadays, concerning rational arguments, I think the fashionable idea is that we need a cumulative argument. That is, we cannot decide a conclusion just by mentioning 1 or 2 pieces of evidence. We need to look at all the evidence. And I think if I have time to cover, we can see that the evidence for intelligent design for ID does not only come from one area. In fact, it covers all facets of our universe. So you look at this diagram, you can see that there are many pieces of evidence which converge on suggesting the source as an intelligence. We have the origin of life, molecular machines. We have talked about all these briefly, but still, if I have time, I can mention the Cambrian explosion of all the animal ancestors, the privileged planet, even our Earth is very fine-tuned in many aspects, which allow for our existence as well as scientific research. And then we can mention the animal superpowers, like the echolocation of bats. And then we can mention beauty of our world on many levels. And then I can mention the mathematical nature of our natural laws, which suggests intelligence. And then fine-tuning, I've talked about that. And then finally, I think the existence of ourself, intelligent consciousness itself is a mystery. And I think that is also suggestive. So I think all the converging evidence, for me, seems to be highly convincing that the source of the universe, if there's a creator, must be very intelligent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kwan. And yeah, the universe is not just a bunch of atoms. It is replete with intelligent information from the Big Bang to molecular machines. We see stark evidence for intelligent design. It challenged the hegemony of random origin. It's very sad, of course, that modern school textbooks still continue to mention those outdated experiments like Miller-Urey as basis for random evolutionism. But Professor Kwan has aptly demonstrated to us how there can be a cumulative argument for intelligence design, and we're thankful. Thank you very much, and I hope you all have enjoyed the talk. I'm sure that you'll be having a number of questions, so we have allotted space for you for that towards the end of the conference. But if you have any questions, you can still jot them down in the chat box so that you can collect some of them and address them during the QA session. However, of course, there is one question that certainly needs our immediate attention, and that's the seeming presence of chaos and evil in the world. There is design, but also appears that there is a lot of chaos and evil in the world. And the question rises, how is it possible that God has designed a beautiful world, and yet the world is filled with evil of all sorts? And so at this moment, I would like to we actually scheduled a 1-minute introduction to be done by Dr. Belsi Isaac from Lucknow College of Theology, but I'm sad to inform that he just sent me a message. He is with us. He is with us, but he's in the hospital along with his mom, who suddenly had a kidney failure, and she's undergoing dialysis right now. So let's keep in prayer. Let's keep his mother in prayer. And Dr. Belsi Isaac is a key member of the Department of Apologetics at CITS. So we keep in prayer for him and his mom as they're there in the hospital. But at this moment, we will go into the next session and examine this question of the problem of evil, which is considered to be a very very aggressive opposition to the argument for the existence of existence for God. And I would like to invite Professor Kayan Chan to present to us the case for the goodness of God. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dominic. Okay, let me upload my PowerPoint. Okay, can you listen my voice clearly and see my PowerPoints?
Yes, can hear
okay,
you.
Okay, thank you. Now, first of all, I want to express my gratitude to Jesus Christ, my God, who gives me this wonderful opportunity to serve and share with my brothers and sisters in India. I treasure and value this opportunity very much. Okay, now, brothers and sisters, let's start. Now, I think a complete case, a cogent case for Christian theism would consist of several parts. The first part, of course, is the positive arguments for the truth of Christian theism. For example, a fine-tuning argument and various cosmological arguments, including Kalam cosmological argument, the argument for the resurrection of Jesus. I think these arguments together provide very powerful positive reasons, positive evidence that Christian theism is true. But in order to complete the case for Christian theism, we also need to reply to the objections to the truth of Christian theism. There are various objections to Christian theism, and we need to reply to those objections. So if we succeed to reply to various objections to Christian theism, and on the other hand, if we can defend cogently the positive arguments for Christian theism, then we shall have a very powerful case for Christian faith. Now, in this part of the presentation, I shall address one of the most important objections to Christian theism, which is the problem of evil. And I shall argue that the objection from the problem of evil is not a piece of cogent evidence that God does not exist. So let me begin. Okay, so you can see my PowerPoint clearly, right? Okay, now, evils are abundant in the world, and there are different kinds of evils. For example, moral evils, which are immoral acts committed by free agents, such as murder, theft, genocide, etc. And natural evils, which are the pain and sufferings resulting from natural processes, such as diseases, hurricanes, tsunami, and earthquakes. Now, the problem of evil is a family of arguments which attempt to show that God does not exist by appealing to the existence of evils in the world, both moral evils and natural evils. These arguments are called arguments from evil. Now, there are different versions of the argument from evil. For example, Mackey's version, William Rowe's version, Paul Draper's version, Michael Tolley's version, etc. However, because of the limitation of time, I shall only address a popular version of the argument from evil, the version formulated by Stephen Law. Though my discussions target at Law's argument, many of my considerations are applicable to other versions of the argument from evil. Now, the main question addressed by my presentation is this one. Is Stephen Law's argument from evil a good argument? Is it a good argument? Now, I'm going to argue that Law's argument is not a good argument, that his argument fails to show that God does not exist. But before I present Stephen Law's argument, I would like to clarify the very meaning of the crucial terms. Okay, so one of the crucial terms I need to clarify is the word God. Okay, so what exactly does this word mean? Okay, what exactly does this word mean? Now, the word God, as understood by the monotheistic world religions such as Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, means a being who is maximally perfect. That is, God is such a being that there cannot possibly be any greater or more perfect being. Now, from the definition of the word God, it follows immediately that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. It follows also that the existence of God, if God exists at all, is necessarily uncaused, beginningless, and endless. Since God is maximally perfect, God, if exists at all, would not depend on anything else, including luck, for his existence. God's existence would be absolutely self-sufficient. What then is meant by the terms omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolent? Now, here are the definitions for these terms. Now, when we describe X as omnipotent, we mean that X is able to do everything which is possible for X to do. For example, I am not omnipotent. Why? Because although it is logically possible for me to raise a man from death, I am not able to do it. So if a being is omnipotent, then he would be able to do everything which is possible for the being to do. So by this definition, we can see clearly that I am not omnipotent. And when we describe X as omniscient, we mean that X knows everything which is possible to be known. Now, by this definition, we can see clearly that I am not omniscient. Why? Because although it is logically possible for me to know the mathematics of quantum mechanics, I do not know it, in fact. And when we describe X as omnibenevolent, we mean that X is, morally speaking, all good in his thoughts, motivations, and acts. And similarly, by this definition, I am not omnibenevolent because sometimes I hurt my wife because of my own selfishness. Okay, now I have already tried to clarify the very meaning of the concept of God. Now we can go to the problem of evil as formulated by Stephen Law. So this is Stephen Law's argument from evil. And I think this is a very popular argument. Now the argument has 5 premises. Okay, so let's start with premise 1. Premise 1, God is by definition omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. Premise 2, if God is omniscient, then God knows how to prevent evil. Premise 3, if God is omnipotent, then God is able to prevent evil. Premise 4, if God is omnibenevolent, then God wants to prevent evil. Now, from these 4 premises, it immediately follows, according to Stephen Law, that if God exists, then evil will not exist. However, statement 6 says, evil exists. Now, from 5 and 6, it immediately follows that God does not exist. Now, this is Stephen Law's argument from evil. Now, is this a good argument? Is this a good argument? Can it present a piece of cogent evidence that God does not exist? Now, I think not. I think not. In what follows, I shall explain my rebuttal of the argument. I am going to show that this is not a good argument. Okay, it is not convincing. Okay, now brothers and sisters, I think that it is doubtful that statement 5 follows from premises 1 to 4. So let us look at it again. Okay, so according to Stephen Law, from premises 1 to 5, we can derive statement 5. However, I'm going to show that statement 5 does not follow from the above premises. Okay, here is a reason why it does not follow from those premises. It is logically possible that God's allowing evils to occur is necessary to the actualization of some greater goods, and that accordingly, God has a morally sufficient reason to allow evils to occur. That means it is possible that if God did not allow certain sorts of evils, then the greater goods could not occur. Okay, so because of those greater goods, because of those greater goods, God allows evils to exist. So that's a possibility overlooked by the argument. Okay. In other words, the argument cannot eliminate this possibility. Therefore, a statement 5 does not follow from premises 1 to 4. That is, I want to say that it is possible that there are some goods which could outweigh the evils, okay, which are the greater goods. However, which would not be possible if God did not allow any evils to occur. So that's a possibility. And because of this consideration, God allows evil to occur. And this can be a morally sufficient reason for God to allow evils to exist. Now, perhaps there are greater goods whose actualization would not be possible if God, if exists at all, does not allow evils to occur. How does Stephen Law know that there are no such greater goods? How does Stephen Law know that God, if exists, cannot have any sufficient reason to allow evils to occur? Law simply has not given any good reasons for thinking that there are no such greater goods. So it is doubtful that statement 5 follows from premises 1 to 4. In this way, statement 1 to 4, premises 1 to 4, fail to show that statement 5 is true. And since we have no good reason for thinking that statement 5 is true, because the premises fail to support statement 5, so we have no good reason for thinking that statement 5 is true. So the argument from 5 and 6 to the final conclusion, that is statement 7, is not a convincing argument. So what might these greater goods be? What might these greater goods be? Now, these suggest some possibilities. Okay, these suggest some possibilities, two of which are the following. Okay, A, free will, and all the goods brought about by free will. And B, soul making. Okay, so these are two possibilities of the aforementioned greater goods, which could justify God's allowing of evils to occur. Okay, let us start with the first possibility of the greater goods, that is free will, as well as the goods brought about by free will. Now, here is a possible reason why God permits evil. Now, moral evils and many sufferings are the results of people misusing their free will. God is morally justified in permitting sufferings and moral evils because free will and the goods produced by free will are highly valuable, and because these values outweigh the evils. produced by the misuse of free will. Now, Alvin Plantinga is one of the most important contemporary defenders of the free will defense. Now, what does the term free will mean? So here is an explanation of the concept of free will. Now, John Depot said, okay, he gives us a good explanation. The exercise of free will involves the ability to act in a way that is not causally determined by any conditions outside of the person's own volition. When a person is free, the person is the ultimate cause of his own actions. If an omnipotent being brought free agents into existence, he could control whether these agents exist, whether the agents have free will, and the circumstances in which they will exercise the free will. But if these creatures are truly free, then not even God can causally determine the outcome of the free choices. Therefore, an omnipotent being cannot create free agents and causally determine them to choose to do good all the time. So that's what the concept of free will means. But why is free will so valuable? Now, John Depot said, since creating people with free will is necessary for making people who are capable of moral agency, this is one important reason to accept that free will is intrinsically valuable. All other moral value derives its moral worth from the intrinsic value of a person's ability to exercise free will. Now, without free will, all other moral values such as love, justice, and courage, unselfish sacrifice for other people's well-being, etc., would be impossible. So this is why free will is so valuable. Now, there are several possible objections to the free will defense. So let us look at these objections. The first objection: the free will defense may explain moral evils, but it does not explain natural evils. Stephen Law said, the most glaring flaw in this defense of theism is that much suffering is natural in origin. Earthquakes, famines, floods, diseases, and so on are not, for the most part, caused by us. If there is a God, then he is responsible for them. Now, here is my reply to Stephen Law's objection. Okay. The free will defense is not targeted at natural evils. Rather, it is targeted at moral evils. With regard to natural evils, a theist can appeal to the soul-making defense to reconcile the existence of natural evils with the existence of God. In other words, a theist can appeal to different defenses to target at different types of evils. A theist can say that it is possible for God to have different reasons for allowing different kinds of evils. The second objection to the free will defense: the free will defense limits God's power. God should be able to create a world where people have free will and always choose the good. However, I think this objection fails because of the following reply. The objection is questionable since even God cannot possibly make it the case, both that people have free will and that people always choose the good. If people are made to always choose the good, then they are not free. The proposition God is able to create a world where people have free will and always choose the good is self-contradictory. And God's omnipotence does not include the power to do self-contradictory things. Okay, so if you remember our definition for the word omnipotence, we can see that omnipotence does not include the power to do self-contradictory things. This is why the objection fails. So we come to the third possible objection to the free will defense. We do not have good evidence for the existence of human free will, or the actions of an individual may well be determined entirely by his biological structure or the environment. However, this is not a good objection to free will defense. Why? Here is the reply. The above objection is confused about the burden of proof. The theist does not need to show that the free will defense is true. The theist is only pointing to some possibilities which are overlooked by the argument from evil. It is the atheist who has the burden of proof to eliminate those possibilities, that is to show that the free will defense is false, that there is no such thing as free will. Now here is an analogy to explain my points. Now consider this example, consider the following argument. Now from statement 1, Edward is absent in this class. Therefore, okay, we derive Edward is sick. Okay, so here is an argument. Okay, to show that Edward is sick. Okay, the evidence is Edward is absent in the class. However, I can challenge this argument by pointing out some possibilities overlooked by the argument. It is possible, I can point out, that Edward is absent not because he is sick, but because he is writing his term paper. It is also possible that Edward is absent because Edward has an appointment with his girlfriend. This is why the conclusion of the argument does not follow from the premise. I do not have the burden of proof to prove that Edward is really writing his paper now, or that he is now with his girlfriend. Rather, it is the advocate of the above argument who has the burden of proof to eliminate the aforementioned possibilities, to show that they do not obtain, or to show that Edward's sickness is the best explanation as compared to other possible explanations. So similarly, the theist is only pointing out some possibilities overlooked by the argument. That is, it is possible that there is such a thing as free will, and it is possible that free will is essential to certain greater goods. Okay, and these possibilities are overlooked by the argument from evil. Now, indeed, there are various attempts to show that human free will does not exist. However, no such attempts are successful. So, brothers and sisters, you can consult this book written by Alfred Meyer, Free Will Science Has Not Disproved Free Will, for a detailed discussion. So there is no evidence showing that free will does not exist. Okay, now we come to the fourth objection. How do we know that the goods brought about by free will can outweigh the evils that result from it? We simply do not have good reason to believe that the free will defense is true. Reply. Again, this objection is confused about the burden of proof. The argument from evil is put forward by atheists to show that theism is false. So it is the atheists who have the burden of proof to show that theism is false. The free will defense is merely a reply to the argument from evil, pointing out some possibilities, as I just said, which are overlooked by the argument from evil. The critics of the argument from evil are not saying that the free will defense is true. They are merely saying that it is a possibility, which is overlooked by the argument from evil. Just as in the above example of Edward's absence in the class, the critics of the argument in the example are not saying that Edward is writing his term paper, nor are the critics saying that Edward is meeting his girlfriend. The critics are merely saying this. First, it is possible that Edward is writing his term paper, and it is also possible that Edward is meeting his girlfriend. Second, these possibilities are overlooked are missed by the argument. That is, these possibilities are not eliminated by the premise of the argument. And therefore, the conclusion of the argument does not follow from the premise. Similarly, the critics of the argument from evil are not asserting that the free will defense is true. Rather, they are merely saying that the free will defense points to a possibility which is missed by the argument from evil, and that accordingly, the conclusion of the argument from evil does not follow from the premise. Therefore, the critics of the argument from evil do not need to show that the free will defense is true. The fifth objection: a good God might be expected to protect the weaker from the misuses of free will of the stronger, as parents would do so to the younger children whose life and health are threatened by the older ones. So this is the fifth objection. However, I think that this objection fails to rebut the free will defense. Okay, why? It is questionable because of the following considerations. First, even for loving parents, in order to avoid greater evils or to secure greater goods, they may permit their children to be hurt. So let's see some examples. Example 1, suppose I am an official of the US government and know highly confidential information of the government. Suppose my little son is kidnapped by North Korean secret agents. If I disclose the highly confidential information about US nuclear weapons, they will immediately release my son. Otherwise, they will kill him. Although I can save my son by giving the information to them, I am justified to allow my son to be harmed in order to avoid a greater evil. And example 2, a father can be justified to allow his son to become a boxer and be hurt by other boxers in competitions for the sake of some greater goods. For example, the son's pursuit of his dreams and becoming a better person. So it is questionable to say that parents would do so to the younger children whose life and health are threatened by the older ones. Okay, so this premise of the objection is itself questionable. Now, the second point in my reply, the premise, that is the later part of the objection, the premise does not entail the conclusion, that is the earlier part of the earlier part of the objection. Okay, the inference is wrong. Okay, so here is my rebuttal. Now, people in different situations have different roles to play and different things appropriate for them to do. For example, children who are naughty in public areas should be disciplined by their parents, not by you or me. What is appropriate for their parents to do is not necessarily appropriate for us to do. Similarly, God's situation or roles are very different from ours. He is the creator and ruler of everything else. He needs to consider the present and future well-being of his creatures and his creation. The considerations he needs to take into account would be very complicated, much more complicated than the considerations we need to take into account in our own situations. What things are appropriate for God to do, therefore, can be very different from what are appropriate for us to do. So the inference is incorrect. The inference of the objection is incorrect. The premise simply does not entail the conclusion. So that's not a good objection. So that is the free will defense. Okay, it points out some possible greater goods which can justify God's allowing of evils to occur in the world. Now, another possible greater goods is pointed out by the soul-making defense. So here is another possible reason why God permits evils. God allows suffering in order to promote moral and spiritual maturity. God wants us to develop character traits that suits us for a relationship with God and others. We develop such character traits by making free choices in challenging situations. God permits natural evils in our environment because a world without suffering would not be conducive to moral or spiritual growth. One of the most important defenders of the soul-making defense is John Hake. Now, there are several possible objections to the soul-making defense. Now, let's turn to these objections. The first objection, the soul-making defense limits God's power. God should be able to create spiritually and morally mature human beings without permitting sufferings. Stephen Law said, "You may wonder why God didn't just make us virtuous to begin with." However, this objection is not convincing. And here is a reply to the objection. The objection fails to see the distinction between a person's being virtuous and a person's behaving as if he is virtuous. Being virtuous and behaving as if one is virtuous are different things. In order to be virtuous, a person must have acted in such a way in the past such that he is now the author of his virtuous character. A person can act as if he is virtuous, although he is not actually virtuous, when an outside force compels or manipulates a person to behave as if he has formed his virtuous character, when in fact he has not. But since part of what it means for someone to have virtue is that the person is the author of these characteristics, it follows that even God cannot create people who are already virtuous. If developing virtuous character is a valuable good that a wholly good being is justified in bringing about, then a wholly good being would not create people who are only predisposed to act as if they have a virtuous character. So God would not and cannot create people who are already virtuous, because virtues are highly valuable character traits only if they are freely chosen and earned by the agents. And the second reason, a virtuous person is necessarily the author of his own virtues, since part of what it means for someone to have virtue is that the person is the author of these characteristics. It follows that God cannot possibly make us virtuous at the very beginning. God can create a robot which acts like a virtuous person, but the robot would not be virtuous. It does not possess any virtues at all. The second objection to the soul-making defense, Stephen Law said, but in any case, if suffering is the unavoidable price we must pay for virtue, it is hard to explain why God dishes out suffering in the way he does. Why do mass murderer dictators live out their lives in luxury? Why do sweet and lovely people have horrendous diseases inflicted on them? It is, to say the least, hard to understand how the seemingly random distribution of suffering in the world is supposed to make us more virtuous. Now, what exactly is Stephen Law's objection? I'm not sure that I understand his objection, but perhaps his objection can be formulated, can be understood in the following way. The objection is an argument which has one premise and one conclusion. Premise one, if God exists, the distribution of suffering in the world would be different from what it is. Therefore, God does not exist. However, I would like to rebut this argument in the following way. Why should we think that premise one is true? Now, Law's reason seems to be two, okay? The first reason, okay, that is 1A for his premise one. The distribution of suffering in the world is unfair. Why do mass murderer dictators live out their lives in luxury? Why do sweet and lovely people have horrendous diseases inflicted on them? The second reason for one is 1B. Evil people, the mass murdering dictators, need much more sufferings in order to be changed to be better people. And good people, the sweet and lovely people, do not need so much sufferings because they are already virtuous. Okay, now I think this argument fails because both 1A and 1B are highly questionable. I don't think that they are good reasons for premise 1. Proposition 1a is ungrounded. If God exists, then the distribution of suffering we see today would likely be a small part of the whole picture only. Stephen Law overlooks this possibility. God will guarantee ultimate justice in the world. This life is only one stage in human life. There are other stages. In other words, there is an afterlife. God's judgment will fall upon evil persons, and God will reward and compensate the upright. For the innocent victims, such as those babies who die early because of the evil deeds of other people, God will compensate them for their losses. So Stephen Law overlooks this possibility. In other words, we have no good reason for thinking that the distribution of suffering in the world is unfair. We have no reason for believing that the distribution of suffering is unfair. Now, proposition 1b is ungrounded too. Encountering with sufferings, good people would become still better persons. The sufferings and moral evils in the world do not make people more virtuous. The sufferings and moral evils in the world do make many people more virtuous. Think of Mother Teresa and others who rise up to the challenges of human sufferings and who rise up to help the sufferers with courage and self-sacrifice. So the sufferings in the world do make many people even more better people, better persons. However, some evil people, for example, the mass murdering dictators, on the other hand, might also have suffered, but they respond to their and other sufferings in a way different from Mother Teresa. They insisted in their self-centered and evil ways of life. It is possible that their hearts are so hardened that no matter how much sufferings falling on them could not change their hearts, and that those sufferings would only make them more cruel and callous. In other words, it is possible that they would not change to become better persons, no matter how much sufferings befall on them. Since propositions 1a and 1b are not good reasons for premise 1, we are not justified for thinking that premise 1 is true. Therefore, Law's objection to soul-making fails. So premise 1 is questionable. This is why this argument fails to be convincing. The third objection, I must be quick because time is quite tight. The third objection, many evils do not seem to contribute to soul making. In fact, many evils have the opposite effect. They ruin character. In reply, 2 points. Point 1, even if God's allowing of a certain suffering could not bring about soul making in a certain person, how do we know that God's allowing of that suffering could not bring about soul making in some other persons? It is difficult for us to know the long-term effects of events. Just think about the butterfly effects. And point 2, for the sake of our character development, God gives us free will to choose how to respond to evils. Since we have free will, it is we and not God who must be responsible for our choice, for our response. Now, the fourth objection, even if human suffering is necessary for human being spiritual and moral maturity, the quantity of suffering needed for spiritual and moral growth is not as much as the world actually contains. And here is a reply to the objection. The burden of proof is on the atheist to show that the quantity of human suffering need to be permitted by God for the sake of human spiritual and moral growth is not as much as the world actually contains. I cannot see any good reasons for accepting that point. It is entirely possible that if God permitted less evils in the world, this would result in a worse balance of good versus evil. The fifth objection, how do we know that the goods brought about by sufferings can outweigh the evils that result from sufferings? We simply do not have good reason to believe that the soul-making defense is true. Here is my reply to the objection. The objection is confused again about the burden of proof. The burden of proof is on the atheist to show that the soul-making defense is false. Theists do not need to show that the soul-making defense is true, for theists do not claim that the defense is true. Theists are only suggesting some possibilities, which the argument from evil may well have overlooked. That is, theists are merely suggesting some possibilities which have not been eliminated by the premise in the argument from evil. So the theist need not prove that the soul-making defense is true. He needs only to defend that the soul-making defense is a possibility. Okay, it is a possible reason for God to allow evils. The sixth objection, the soul-making defense does not explain animal sufferings. Animals do not have moral character to be improved or free will to be exercised. They are innocent too. They do not deserve sufferings. Now, in order to answer this objection, theists put forward several defenses. For example, Neo-Cartesianism, as well as the greater goods defense. Now, brothers and sisters, because of the limitation of time, I think I cannot go into the details of these slides, okay, these PowerPoints. I trust that you can read my PowerPoints on your own, and my PowerPoints are written in very details and clearly. So I must skip this part on the problem of animal suffering. And I have written clearly and in very details. So I hope that you can read on your own, okay? So I must come to the end of the presentation. Now, here is another rebuttal of Stephen Law's argument. We call it skeptical theism, okay? This is a way, this is another way to rebut Stephen Law's argument from evil. Now, even if we cannot find any greater goods, which can justify God if exists to permit evils in the world, it does not follow that there are no such goods because of the vastness and complication of the world and because of the limitation of human knowledge. Hence, statement 5 in Law's argument from evil simply does not follow from his premises 1 to 4. Here is an analogy. Even if we cannot find any extraterrestrial creatures in the universe, it does not follow that there are no such creatures because of the vastness and complications of the universe. And there may even be other universes too, and because of the limitations of human knowledge. The theists argue in the above way are called skeptical theists, and their way of defending theism against the problem of evil is called skeptical theism. So here, brothers and sisters, I have presented 3 ways to rebut the argument from evil. So I must come to my conclusion. Now, since Stephen Law fails to show that God, if exists, must not have sufficient moral reasons to allow evils to occur in the world, we can reasonably doubt the correctness of the inference from premises 1 to 4 to conclusion 5 in his argument. Because of the above considerations, I conclude that Stephen Law's argument from evil is not a good argument. I also have some personal application, but I leave it to you to read on your own. So I must stop here because of the limitation of time. So Dominic, I give back the time to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chan, for tremendous input and explanation of the various ways in which this problem of evil is tackled, the free will defense and soul-making defense. Especially, we have looked into that. Of course, due to the limitation of time, Dr. Chan has not been able to explain the final slides, but as is being requested, I'm getting requests from many of our delegates to send the PowerPoint. So as soon as the conference is over, I will send Dr. Chan's PowerPoint to your emails, to all the emails of those who have registered, the registrants' emails. So now we move to the next session, the last talk, again by Dr. Loke, Andrew Loke, and he will be sharing on the evidences for resurrection. And I would like to invite Reverend T.V. Thomas. Thomas T.V., are you there? Reverend T.V. Thomas?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Dominic.
Please introduce the topic. Reverend T.V. Thomas is the principal of Susamachar Theological College and ATA College in Bhopal, the capital of Madhya Pradesh.
Yeah, thank you, Dominic, for this time and for these sessions. Great presentation from the panel of scholars today. Very happy to hear. It is true that illogical and the objectional and the mere speculative arguments are not right from of God. But as we are here today, it is always the fine-tuned philosophical, theological, and historical arguments or position can support and help us to substantiate our cardinal doctrine, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Let the historical evidence of Jesus, resurrection of Jesus Christ by Dr. Luke may encourage and guide us for a strong conviction in witnessing. Power to Dr. Luke for his time to present us, which may encourage everyone for a greater conviction in witnessing.
Thank you, Reverend Thomas, and I would like to invite Dr. Andrew Loke back to present the case for the resurrection of Christ.
Well, thank you so much, Reverend Thomas, and thank you so much, Dominic. So now we are going to talk about the final part of today's conference. Is on the resurrection of Jesus, and I believe that this is a very relevant topic for today, knowing that the COVID-19 virus has affected so many lives around the world, and that many people are very well aware, right, of the fragility of life, that our lives are fragile, and knowing that our lives are transient and can easily end, right? Can be killed by even a small virus. So we want to know whether is there life after death, right? Is there afterlife? And just now, when we listened to the presentation by Kayan, we also realized that the afterlife, right, is a very important perspective, right, to address the problem of evil and suffering, right? So if there is an afterlife, then surely God can make everything right in the afterlife, and we will understand the purposes of God for allowing evil and suffering, right, in the afterlife, even if we don't understand it now, right? So, so whether there's an afterlife or not is a very important issue, and for us Christians, we have good reasons to believe that there is an afterlife because our Savior, Jesus Christ Himself, rose from the dead, right? He overcome death, and so give us real hope of eternal life. For all who trust in Him, for everyone who believes in Him, we can have the hope that we will be with Him forever, right? So this is the good news, right? We know that our sins can be forgiven because Christ died for us on the cross, and we know that we can be with God forever because Jesus rose from the dead. He overcome death, and therefore He can give us eternal life. Now, and therefore the resurrection of Jesus, right, is of central importance for the Christian faith. Now, there are a lot of people today who are skeptical about the resurrection of Jesus. They wonder whether is this a myth or not. However, what many people are not aware of is that there are in fact a lot of great scientists, philosophers, historians who have looked into the evidence for the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection and conclude that Jesus did indeed rose from the dead. Right? So this is not a myth. Right? In fact, this is a historical fact, and we have good reasons to believe that this is true. Right, so here I mentioned a few well-known scientists and philosophers and historians, such as Francis Collins. He was the director of the Human Genome Project, right? And in 2003, the scientists outlined the human genome, and Francis Collins was the director of the project, and he is a Christian. Now he was an atheist before, right? So many years ago, he didn't believe in God, but after he looked into the arguments for the existence of God and also looked into the historical evidence for Jesus, he came to realize that Jesus did rose from the dead, and that was how he converted from an atheist to become a Christian. And so he would go around the world today to give talks on science and Christianity, and he would also sometimes talk about the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection as well, right? So him and many others, I have no time to explain them all, but these are just a few examples of great intellectuals who have looked into the evidence, right, and conclude that Jesus did rose from the dead. And now, in fact, the evidence for Jesus' resurrection is very strong, but it's a pity that a lot of people don't know how strong the evidence actually is, right? Now, the fact is that despite disagreements about various aspects of the New Testament, I mean, atheists and Christians disagree, right, about whether the Bible is true or not. But despite all these disagreements, there is in fact widespread agreement among historians, whether Christians or non-Christians, that firstly, Jesus died due to Roman crucifixion. Secondly, very soon afterwards, a number of people had experiences that they believe were appearances of the risen Jesus. So very soon after Jesus died on the cross, a number of people experienced something. They saw him. They had experience which they think they saw him alive after Jesus' crucifixion. And thirdly, the body, the tomb of Jesus was empty. Right, the body of Jesus was missing, empty tomb. Right. So even though historians disagree about other parts of the New Testament, but there's a wide consensus. Most of them agree on these three historical facts. Right? And so on the basis of these three historical facts, we can actually infer that Jesus did rose from the dead. I will explain that later on, right? So let me first of all talk about why did historians agree on these three facts, right? Now let's talk about the first one. Jesus was crucified by the Romans in around the year AD 30. Now this is a historical fact testified not only by early Christian sources, but also in early non-Christian sources. So we have non-Christian historians like Josephus in the 1st century and Tacitus in the early 2nd century, noting this fact, right, they acknowledge that this happened in history. So in fact, there's almost all historians today, whether Christians or non-Christians, atheists or not, they agree that Jesus existed, right? He was not a legendary figure; he was a real historical figure, right, who was crucified by the Romans in around the year AD 30. Now, the key question is what happened after that? What happened after Jesus was crucified? Now, we read in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that shortly after Jesus was crucified, a lot of people claim to have seen Jesus alive after he was crucified, right? So, for example, in this passage in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul, and this was written very early, right? This was written around the year, written before AD 55, right? And Paul was actually citing even earlier traditions. Paul wrote that Christ was crucified, he died for our sins, and he was buried, and then he was raised on the 3rd day. How do we know? Because he appeared to Cephas, which is Peter, and then he appeared to the 12 disciples. After that, he appeared to more than 500 people at the same time, and many of whom were still alive when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 15, right? And he also appeared to James and then to other apostles, right? So we can see here that Paul is claiming that Jesus resurrected and he appeared to groups of people, right? The 12 disciples, the 500, and then other apostles, and also it appeared to individuals, including Cephas and then James, and also to Paul himself, right? And by the way, Paul himself was a non-Christian, right? Paul was an enemy of Christians. He was a persecutor of Christians, but he converted because he saw Jesus alive. After he also saw the resurrected Jesus himself, right? And so these are the evidence for thinking that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, when we look at this text, of course, skeptics will have questions to ask. We know from that the various 1st century New Testament texts claim that there were people who saw Jesus alive, but skeptics would ask, could it be that these people actually didn't exist? Maybe. Could it be that these so-called eyewitnesses, they were fabricated many years later, right? Or these eyewitnesses were fabricated in the 1st century? So nowadays, there are some people who suspect, well, maybe people changed the Bible after many years, right? So maybe in the 1st century, the Bible actually doesn't talk maybe, so some skeptics would ask, maybe in the first century, actually there were no people who claimed to have seen Jesus live, but these details about the 500, about the 12 disciples, could it be that these were added into the Bible, maybe hundreds of years later, right? So people changed the Bible after many years, and that's why we read it in the Bible today, but maybe this is not in the original Bible. Or could it be that this is in the original Bible, but maybe the person who wrote it fabricated? Maybe Paul lied. Maybe Paul, it was a conspiracy, right? Maybe Paul made it up, or maybe Paul got it from someone else who made it up, right? So these are all possibilities which we will need to exclude, right, in order to establish that Jesus rose from the dead. So let's talk about the first possibility first. Could it be that these eyewitnesses were fabricated many years later? Could it be that the Bible was changed over time? Now, no historians today accept this hypothesis, whether atheists or really Christians or non-Christians. This hypothesis is rejected by all historians. Why? Because we have plenty of historical evidences in the form of the early text of the New Testament. We have many ancient manuscripts of the New Testament, which shows that the New Testament accounts of Jesus' resurrection, in particular, for example, which we read in 1 Corinthians 15, these accounts were not added into the Bible years later, right? 1 Corinthians 15 was not added into the Bible years later. Rather, 1 Corinthians 15 was found in the original text. And we can know this because we have a lot of ancient manuscripts, right, from which we can infer that this is the case. So historians, archaeologists have discovered more than 5,000 over ancient Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, which they can compare, and they can trace, they can examine this evidence and trace the account in 1 Corinthians 15 all the way back, right? And they can infer that this came from the first century, right? And this manuscript evidence is far more than the evidence for other ancient documents, right? So we have more ancient manuscripts for the New Testament than other ancient manuscripts, say, for example, for Julius Caesar, or which no historian doubt, right, that he actually existed, for example, right? So we have far more manuscript evidence compared to other ancient historical books. And the important point to note here is that these ancient manuscripts, they are found in many, many places, right? So it is practically impossible for any persons to coordinate a conspiracy that changed all the documents on all these places, at the same time. No one would be able to synchronize, right, changing all the manuscripts in all these different places such that they all look the same. No, there's no way anybody can do that. So what this means is that if somebody wants to change the Bible, he can only change the Bible around his location, right? So for example, if somebody want to change, so for example, if somebody in Italy, for example, if somebody in Italy wants to change the Bible, he can only change the Bible around Italy, right? It is impossible for him to change the Bible in France, in Spain, in Syria, in North Africa. No, there's no way anybody can coordinate such a change, right, across so many different places, in and outside the Roman Empire, right? I mean, they are all scattered over the place, right? So no one could synchronize all the change, right, that leave behind no traces. So what this means is that if somebody wants to change the Bible, he can only change the Bible in his place, but he cannot change the Bible in other places. So when historians compare the ancient manuscripts of the Bible, they will be able to detect whether anybody has changed the Bible. Why? Because when they compare the manuscripts from all these different places, when they compare the manuscripts from Italy and the manuscripts from Spain, for example, if somebody changed the Bible in Italy, right, they will notice that historians would notice that the Bible in Italy will be different from the Bible in Spain, for example, right? Because the people changed the Bible in Italy, the Bible will be different from the Bible from Spain. And so when historians compare the manuscripts from Italy and from Spain, they will notice a difference. And so they'll be able to detect whether the Bible has been changed over time or not, right? And so this is how historians are able to detect any change. And by examining all this evidence, historians can conclude that 1 Corinthians 15 was not changed over time, right? In fact, the accounts in 1 Corinthians 15 can be traced all the way back, right, to the original. And that's how historians can determine that the account in 1 Corinthians 15 was not added by people, right, after many years. Rather, it is found in the original Bible. That was what is written in the first century. Okay, so that refutes the first skeptical hypothesis. Now, in addition to the huge amount of evidence we have on the Greek New Testament manuscripts, we also have early translations of the New Testament into Greek, into Latin, in other languages, right? Now we know that the New Testament was written in Greek, but it was translated into other languages very early on, from the 2nd century onwards. And then, and there's also, and so by examining all these translations, which are based on even earlier copies of the New Testament, historians are also able to detect, also be able to trace whether the Bible has been changed over time or not, right? So this is another additional source of evidence, right, for historians to determine what is it that the original text of the Bible actually says. Now, in addition to this huge amount of evidence, we also have other evidence, which is the citations of the New Testament by other authors from the late 1st century onwards. So we know that from the end of the 1st century onwards, people were already quoting from the Bible. And when they quote from the Bible, of course, they are already quoting from something which already existed, right? So this proves that the New Testament already existed in the 1st century, right? So, and by looking at their quotations, historians are also able to determine, what does the New Testament in the 1st century looks like, right? So by looking at these quotations from Clement of Rome in the end of 1st century, and then Ignatius, early 2nd century, by looking at all this evidence, historians can determine that 1 Corinthians was already written in the 1st century, right? So this is another important source of evidence. So on the basis of all this evidence, there is no doubt that all historians agree that all this evidence indicate that the list of eyewitnesses in the 1 Corinthians chapter 15, this was written by someone in the 1st century. Okay, so we already established this fact. Now, but the skeptic will ask, could it be that, okay, this is written in the 1st century, but could it be that somebody in the 1st century fabricated the information? Right? Could it be that Paul made it up, or Paul got it from someone else who made it up? Now, there are at least 6 reasons why this is unreasonable, right? Now, the first reason is that we need to understand that these ancient people, including the readers of the early Christian letters, they were actually highly skeptical about bodily resurrection. So, and this is an important point to note, because a lot of people today think that people in the 1st century, they are very superstitious, so they would easily believe in stories or legends or myths about resurrections. Well, actually, this is it's not so straightforward as that, because the audience of Paul's letters, they were ancient Greeks, and many ancient Greeks, especially the readers of New Testament, they were actually skeptical of bodily resurrection. Why? Because even though these people in the 1st century, even though they are not, even though they don't have the knowledge of modern science, but nevertheless, based on their, based on their common experience, they know that when the person is dead, he's dead, right? It won't be that somebody who died after a few days, he would come alive again naturally, right? Even people in the ancient world also know that, that is not something that they expect to see that happen naturally, right? So a dead person stays dead, right? So this is a common belief, right, in the ancient world too. And moreover, the ancient Greeks were particularly skeptical of resurrection. Why? Because according to ancient Greek philosophy, what they believe about the afterlife is that the soul of the people will be in heaven. That is how they conceive the eternal state, right? It is the soul, it is the spirit that will be with God, and the body, the body stays dead, right? The body rots, right? The body will not be resurrected. So that is the common belief, right, among the intelligent Greeks, right? And this is the belief that we find in Plato, in Aristotle. That is how they think about the afterlife, right? So, well, there are some myths in ancient Greek philosophy about resurrection, but those were rejected by the intellectuals, Greeks, the Greeks who were intellectuals, people like Plato, etc., and Cicero and Homer, right? Now, we can find this skepticism among the readers of 1 Corinthians too, right? So in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 12, it says that, but it is preached that Christ has been raised from the dead. How can some of you say that there's no resurrection of the dead? So this indicates that even in the church itself, there are people who are skeptical of bodily resurrection, and this fits with what we know about the philosophy of ancient Greeks. So what this means is that the readers of the New Testament, they will not be so easily persuaded that Jesus rose from the dead, right? Many of them were skeptical, and they will want to look into the evidence, right? So this is the first point. And the second point is that for these early Christians, it is a life and death issue, right? The resurrection, right? Just like there are Christians in India today who are persecuted, right? I understand that there are some Indian Christians who are persecuted by non-Christians. Likewise, in the first century, many Christians were persecuted for their faith as well. Many of them have to be prepared to sacrifice their lives everything they have, for what they believe, right? For the resurrection, for the resurrection. So it's a life and death issue for them, right? It is not something trivial, right? So there's something that they will take seriously. So what this implies is that if somebody claimed that Jesus already resurrected, these people would want to check it out, right? Given that many of them are skeptical, and given that this is such an given that many of them are skeptical, and given that this is something that's so important, people would want to find out whether Paul is telling the truth or not, right? Whether are there really these people who claim to have seen Jesus alive or not? Okay, and so these people would want to find out. They want to check out. And the third point is that they could check out, right, if there were indeed such eyewitnesses. Why? Because the evidence inside and outside the Bible indicates that first of all, the early Christian movement was a network of close communication. The early Christian leaders, including these people like James, Peter, who are supposed to have seen the resurrected Jesus, these people were traveling around the early churches, and so people could check with them, right? So Paul claims that Peter saw Jesus alive, right? The early Christians can check with Peter himself, right? Peter, is it true that you saw Jesus? No. What did Jesus after he died on the cross? You saw him alive? What did Jesus look like? How did he look like? People can check with Peter, right? People can check with James. So people can verify, right, with these people themselves, right? So they can easily check out. They can easily find out whether Paul was telling the truth or not. Moreover, many of these Jewish Christians, many among the Christians, they were also Jews, right? The 12 disciples were Jews, for example. The Jewish Christians would scatter around the Roman Empire. They would travel every year to Jerusalem for religious festivals, right? And so people can meet each other. People will meet one another, and they can check with one another whether there are people who saw Jesus alive or not, right? So people can verify with each other. And so, and moreover, many of these people were still supposed to be alive in AD 55, right? Remember, I mentioned just now that we have evidence indicates that 1 Corinthians 15 was written very early, right? It's written in the year AD 55, and AD 55 is within 25 years after Jesus was crucified. So many of these eyewitnesses, these so-called eyewitnesses, many of them will still be alive. They will still be around, right, for people to verify with them. In fact, that was what Paul himself claimed, right? Paul says among the 500 people, most of them remain until now, right? So people can check with them, right? So Paul is saying to the skeptics that if you don't believe that Jesus resurrected, you can go and check with these people. They can tell you what they saw, right? So here, Paul is saying that in this passage that most of the 500 people are still alive, inviting any reader to check out the truth of the story by questioning the eyewitnesses. Now, Paul could not have done this and got away with it, given the power, resources of his enemies, if this is not true. So what this means is that Paul must be telling the truth, right? When he claimed that there were all these people who saw Jesus alive after Jesus was crucified. And also when we read the 1 Corinthians, we know that the 1 Corinthians, the Corinthians knew these people too, as I mentioned earlier on, right? They knew James, they knew Peter, so they can check them. Now, fourthly, if no one claimed to have seen Jesus resurrected after he was crucified, Christianity could not have started in the first place and continued, right? Christianity would have ended with the death of Jesus. That will be finished, right? I mean, the historical evidence outside the Bible indicates that around the first century, there were other people who claimed to be the Messiah, but after they were killed by the enemies, their followers disbanded, right? Nobody claimed that nobody followed them anymore, right? And so if nobody claimed to have seen Jesus alive after Jesus was crucified, no people would continue to follow Jesus anymore after he was crucified on the cross. So Christianity would have ended in the first century if that were the case. And the fifth point is that we have multiple historical sources, right? Other than 1 Corinthians 15, we have other documents written in the 1st and 2nd century, such as the 4 Gospels, Acts, other letters written by Paul, and also outside the Bible, we have 1 Clement, the letters of Ignatius, etc. So all these multiple sources also indicate that many people saw Jesus alive after he was crucified, right? So it's not only one source, but we have multiple independent sources which indicate that this is what really happened. And sixthly, many enemies of Jesus those people who crucified Jesus, they were still around, they were still alive also in the first century, and they were challenging Christians' claims, right? They were, for example, they claimed that Jesus' disciples stole his body after Jesus was crucified. So these enemies of Jesus, they are evidently motivated to debunk Christianity. And so if there were no people who claimed to have seen Jesus alive, if this was a conspiracy, the enemies of Jesus would have exposed this conspiracy, right? They would have, and Christianity would have collapsed under the challenge of these enemies. And Christianity would have ended in the first century if that were the case. So, given all this evidence, we can conclude that it is no wonder that, as I said just now, all historians today, whether Christians or non-Christians, they agree that after Jesus was crucified, many people claim to have seen Jesus alive after he was crucified, right? There is no doubt that this account in 1 Corinthians 15 came from people who attest an overwhelming experience. Okay, so this is the second historical fact which I have established. Now, given this historical fact, some people may wonder, okay, given that all historians agree on this, why is it that there are still historians who don't believe that Jesus resurrected, right? Why are there still some atheists, historians who think that, who didn't believe that Jesus resurrected? Well, the reason is because for those historians who don't believe that Jesus resurrected, they try to explain this fact away, right? So instead of thinking that Jesus saw the resurrected, instead of saying that the disciples saw the resurrected Jesus, those non-Christian historians, those atheist historians would say that, well, maybe, yes, the disciples have some experience, but maybe it was a hallucination, right? So the hallucination theory, right? And others would suspect that, well, maybe it's some other explanations which we haven't realized what's the answer. Maybe there's some other explanation which we haven't thought of, right? So they come up with various possibilities to try to explain away these historical facts. Now, in my book on the resurrection, which Dominic mentioned earlier on, I provided a proof to prove that Jesus resurrected, and it is in the form of the following logical syllogism, right? So we have already established that it's a historical fact that shortly after Jesus was crucified, many people claim to have seen Jesus alive, right? And given that this is a fact, there's only a few possible explanations. The first explanation is that these people claim that they saw the resurrected Jesus, but maybe they didn't see anything, right? So maybe it was a conspiracy. Maybe they made it up, right? They didn't see anything, but they claimed that they saw Jesus alive. So either they didn't see anything, or they did see something, right? They did experience something, but maybe their experience was caused by something inside their mind, right? So maybe it was a hallucination. So either it was caused by something inside their mind, or it was caused by something outside their mind, right? So there was a real person that they saw, right? Somebody outside their mind whom they saw. But maybe this person was not Jesus, right? Maybe it was someone else. Maybe they mistook another person for Jesus. Maybe they misidentified another person for Jesus. So either the person whom they saw is not Jesus, or the person whom they saw was Jesus, right? So either it's not Jesus or it was Jesus. So it was Jesus, but maybe Jesus did not die on the cross, right? So there are some people today who suspected that maybe Jesus just fainted on the cross, and then he was buried, and then 3 days later Jesus woke up, right? He didn't actually die; he just fainted, and then he woke up, and then he escaped from the tomb, and then showed himself to the disciples. Hey guys, I'm alive. Right? That's how people started believing that Jesus resurrected. So this is called the soon theory, right? The soon hypothesis. So maybe Jesus didn't die on the cross, or maybe he wasn't crucified. Maybe he escaped, right? Maybe Jesus ran away. The enemies of Jesus caught another person and crucified the wrong guy, right? And then Jesus appeared again 3 days later and say, hey guys, I'm here, right? And that's how the disciples thought that he was alive. So maybe Jesus didn't die on the cross, right? So this is one possibility which we need to exclude. So either Jesus did not die on the cross, or he did die on the cross. Now, if Jesus did die on the cross, then the earliest Christians must have saw the Jesus who died on the cross and who was alive again. So this means that Jesus rose from the dead, right? So by looking at this logically, we can see that there is only a few possibilities, right? Either the disciples did not see anything, or it was a hallucination, or they mistook someone else for Jesus, or Jesus did not die on the cross, he fainted on the cross, or they crucified the wrong guy, or Jesus rose from the dead, right? They saw Jesus alive again. He died and he was seen alive again. He was really resurrected, right? So there are only these few possibilities. There are no other possibilities. And so the question is, which of this possibility is the truth, right? Okay, so now let's look at this one by one. Okay, could it be that the disciples did not see anything? Could it be that it was a conspiracy? The disciples didn't see anything, but they claimed that they saw Jesus alive. Now, almost no historian today accept this hypothesis. Why? Because, firstly, no group of people will be willing to sacrifice everything for what they knew is false and be sent to hell by God for being false witnesses. Now, I mentioned early on that the earliest Christians were willing to sacrifice their lives for Christianity, right? Many of them, in fact, sacrificed their lives. They died as martyrs for their faith. Now, we know that many people will be willing to die for what they believe is true, even though it may not be true. Right? But we will not find many people who will be willing to die for what they know is false. Right? So, for example, we know that there are also Islamic terrorists, for example. Right? Islamic terrorists, there are many Islamic terrorists who have been willing to die for their faith. Right? They also die for their faith. But the reason why the Muslim terrorists are willing to die for their faith is because they sincerely believe what they believe to be true, or even though it may not be true, right? But they believe that, and the reason why they are willing to die for their faith is because they believe that it is true, right? But nobody will be willing to die and give up everything for what they know is false, right? And certainly they will not be willing to be sent to hell by God for what they know is false, if they believe in God, right? Now, the early Christians are people who believe in God, and they are very sincere in their faith, right? And they believe in heaven, they believe in hell, and they believe that if they are false witnesses, they will be punished by God after life, right? In the afterlife. And so, given that, and many of them did sacrifice their lives for their faith as well. So, given that this is a fact, we know that when they say that they saw Jesus alive, they are not making this up. Why? Because if the disciples made it up, right, they will know that it's false, right? Because they made it up, right? So no group of people will be willing to sacrifice everything for what they know is false. So what this means is that the disciples did not make up this story. They really saw something, right? So this is the first point. And moreover, having seen how horribly Jesus had died on the cross, these disciples were greatly fearful of ever mentioning Jesus again, right? They were also, many of them were doubtful initially as well, right? So the disciples must have experienced something that transformed their lives, such that these disciples who were fearful, who were doubtful initially, were transformed into brave proclaimers and even martyrs, right, for Jesus' resurrection. So the disciples must have seen something, right, that convinced them that Jesus was alive, in order that they'll be willing to give up everything for the Christian faith, right? And they go out into the world to proclaim that Jesus was alive, right? They must have experienced something that convinced them to do that. Now, could it be that they saw hallucinations, right? Could it be that there were some hallucinations? Now, again, this is not reasonable. Why? Because it's not just one or two persons, right? We're talking about groups of people here, right? So if only one person or two person, it could be hallucination, right? But it's unreasonable to think that groups of people could be seeing the same thing together when there's actually nothing there, right? It's just like I'm talking to all of you now. There are at least 50 over people here who are listening to me, right? So it's unreasonable to think that all of you are seeing a hallucination, right? You're seeing something here, and all of you can verify with each other, right? You can check with each other what you saw, right? So this is not a hallucination. It's seen by groups of people. So there must be something there that they saw, right? Now, there are a lot of details which I have no time to explain, but you can check out my book, which explains all this in greater detail. All this evidence which refutes the intra-mental hypothesis, right? So there are multiple evidence considerations against the intra-mental hypothesis. But the point is that we just need to know that it is unreasonable to think that a large group of people could be seeing something there when there's actually nothing there, right? So there must be somebody there whom they saw. Could it be someone else? Could it be that they mistook another person for Jesus? Again, this is ridiculous. Why? Because the disciples knew Jesus very well, right? He was their teacher. They lived with him for many years, right? So if the disciples did not check carefully to make sure that it was Jesus, they would not have been willing to believe that he resurrected and be willing to give up everything for it, right? So the disciples in fact, they must have checked carefully to make sure that it was Jesus, right? Before they can be convinced that he was actually resurrected, and before they are willing, right, to give up everything to die for their faith. Right? So they must have checked carefully to make sure that it was Jesus. Now, could it be that they crucified the wrong guy? Again, this is even more ridiculous. No historian today believe this. Why? Because the crucifixion was a public event, and Jesus was a public figure, so his enemies knew about him, other people knew about him. So it is unlikely that all the enemies of Jesus, the disciples, and other members of the public, all of them failed to recognize that it was not Jesus who was crucified. Okay, so no, this is ridiculous. So it must be Jesus, right, who was crucified. Now, finally, could it be that Jesus fainted on the cross, right? Again, almost no historian today believe in this, right? This is ridiculous. Why? Well, first of all, historians have discovered the historical evidence which indicates that the crucifixion was one of the most severe form of torture in the ancient world. Right? So before the ancient Romans crucified someone, they would whip the person first, right? And the flogging, the whip that they use for the flogging is extremely brutal, right? Form of torture. The whip that they use have those iron spikes, iron nails attached to those whip, to the whip, right? Such that when you whip a person and you pull up the whip, right, the flesh, the skin, the flesh, the tendons, the blood vessels, and sometimes even the intestines will come out, right, from the whipping. Right? So it's a brutal form of punishment, and such that sometimes people would die from blood loss even before they were crucified, just from the whipping alone. Right? I'm sure you all have seen movies, Passion of the Christ, these movies which depict the whipping of Jesus. Right? It is brutal, right? And so Jesus was not only whipped, but he was crucified. He was pierced. He was speared, right, in all kinds of ways. So it's unreasonable to think that anybody, right, could have survived this kind of torture. Right? So this is the first point. Now the second point is that even if Jesus survived, he would have been severely injured. He'll be half dead. Right? Now a half dead Jesus, still suffering from the wounds of the crucifixion, would not have persuaded the disciples that he was the reason of life. I mean, you can imagine a Jesus, right, severely wounded, right? How could he still have pushed away the heavy stone which covered the tomb, and still managed to escape from the guards, right? And still managed to persuade the disciples that he was alive. I mean, when the disciples saw Jesus in that state, well, hey guys, I'm alive, the disciples wouldn't believe that he resurrected. The disciples would say, well, this guy, he just survived somehow by chance, and we need to save him, right? The disciples wouldn't believe that he is the Lord of life. No, they wouldn't believe that he's God. No, they wouldn't believe that he was a saint. The disciples, seeing Jesus in such a state, they wouldn't believe that he is the savior. They would believe that Jesus is someone who needs to be saved, right? We need to save him, otherwise he will die, right? So a Jesus still suffering from the wounds of crucifixion would never have persuaded the disciples that he is the risen Lord of life, right? That he is God, right? He's the Creator incarnate, right? It wouldn't happen that way. So what this means is that what this means is that this hypothesis doesn't explain how is it that the earliest Christians did believe that Jesus was resurrected, that Jesus was God, that they worship Jesus, and they are willing to die for Jesus. So this hypothesis does not explain all these historical facts. So this hypothesis failed. Okay, so in conclusion, the historical evidence indicate that there were people in the first century who claimed that they had seen Jesus alive after his crucifixion. Now, they did not make this up. They truly saw something. And what they saw was not caused intramentally, but was caused extramentally. There was a real person they saw. And the real person they saw is not another person. It was Jesus himself. And Jesus, and this is the same Jesus who died on the cross and was seen alive again. Therefore, this proves that Jesus resurrected, right? And therefore, we have the real hope of eternal life. Right? So this is the proof of Jesus' resurrection. So praise the Lord, right? We serve a living Savior who give us salvation and real hope. All right, so glory be to God, right? If you want to find out more, you can check out my book, Investigating the Resurrection of Jesus, and you can download this book online. Okay, so I shall end my talk here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andrew Loke, for the wonderful presentation. And Dr. Loke's book, I have sent the link earlier to your registered emails. You can click on the link and download the previous book which he mentioned, God and Ultimate Origins. When I saw the book, you can search for the book on Amazon. you'll be surprised, is around 8,000 or 9,000 rupees. The book is very difficult to buy for an ordinary Indian. So at that time when he published that, I wrote to him and said, Dr. Loke, this is really outrageous. But well, academic publishings are like that. And so we are very grateful that this book now is available for free download with the generous support of Hong Kong Baptist University. So you can click on that book and download it. And so we have come to the end of the talks. Now is the time for Q&A, question and answers. You can ask questions to the speakers. We don't have much time for that. I mean, we can allot around 20 minutes for that. And also grateful and nice to see Bishop Joseph Hivale from Koinonia. We'll switch to him later on while he concludes with the final prayer. But before that, we have Q&A. So if any one of you have any questions, you can type in the question here or use the microphone to talk. But I will try to first project some questions on the screen for the resource persons to see and answer some of them. After that, we'll give time for those who would like to use the microphone to ask questions. All right, so let me display some questions first for. We have the first question on the Kalam cosmological argument, and this is asked by Pastor Luther. Now, Pastor Luther has been posting a lot of comments, plethora of commending comments, which prove that he has been very, very attentively listening to the talks. So here is a question: why using the term libertarian in relation to the first cause? Any particular reason?
Well, so the term libertarian free will is standardly used in the philosophical literature to describe a kind of notion of freedom, in which a person is really free, right, to choose between A or not A, for example, right, and the person is the first cause of his choice, right. So the person is not forced, right, by someone else to choose something, right, but he himself decides what he wants to choose, right. So this is the term that is standardly used in the philosophical literature to label such a kind of freedom. Now I'm not sure why they use the word libertarian, but this is the standard terminology, right, that is used to describe this kind of freedom. Yeah.
No, I can supplement some information here. In fact, concerning free will, there are the three major positions. Some deny the reality of free will, and this is called hard determinism. And then for those who they believe in free will, either they have a libertarian free will or compatibilist free will. Libertarian free will means that the free will is really undetermined, not entirely determined by the preceding events, but compatibilist free will is a kind of free will which is compatible with some sort of determinism. So libertarian is the correct label for the belief in the reality of free will in the contemporary literature about free will. And it is not political. It does not mean the political perspective of libertarianism like Robert Nozick. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Loke and Dr. Kwan. Let's move to the next question. Big Bang. According to Big Bang theory, what caused the initial explosion and what came before the Big Bang? I think these questions can be combined.
Yeah, so nowadays there are different cosmologists who try to come up with different explanations for the origin of Big Bang. So some suspected that maybe before our universe, maybe there could be another universe before that, right? So so it's a cyclical universe view. Some people have speculated about that, right? So some other people speculate that it could be some different brains which collapse together and cause this explosion. So there have been various theories which have been suggested, right, to explain the Big Bang, but all of them face severe difficulties, both from a scientific point of view and also from a philosophical point of view, right? So from the scientific point of view, these theories violate the generalized second law of thermodynamics, Now, I mentioned just now that according to the law of thermodynamics, entropy increases with time, right? Entropy increases with time, and so things become more and more disorderly, right? So what this means is that if there is another universe before this universe and another universe before this universe, if there's an infinite regress, then what we should expect is that it will have been totally disorderly, right, by our universe by the time our universe came about, right? But that is not the case. I mean, our universe is highly ordered, right? In fact, the Big Bang itself has to be highly ordered, right, in order to give rise to the expansion of space-time, which results in all these stars and galaxies. Now, just now, Professor Kwan talked about the fine-tuning, right? So the fine-tuning argument, the fine-tuning indicates that the initial state of the universe, of our universe, must be highly ordered. We must have very, very low entropy, right? So those other theories which try to explain away the first cause, they won't work from a scientific point of view, right? They are contradicted by the second law of thermodynamics. And now some people have wondered, maybe the second law of thermodynamics just apply within our universe. But however, Aaron Waugh, who is a physicist at Cambridge University, he has formulated what is known as the generalized second law of thermodynamics, which shows that it will work even not just restricted to our universe. It's a generalized second law of thermodynamics, and it will work even for the quantum era as well. So some cosmologists suspect that maybe before the Big Bang, it was a quantum state. It was a kind of quantum vacuum, and then our Big Bang happened, right? So some cosmologists suspect that maybe the second law of thermodynamics doesn't work in the quantum era. Well, Aaron Waugh has actually argued against that, right, in his paper, which defends the generalized second law of thermodynamics, which shows that the second law will work even for the quantum era as well. Right? So this is the scientific argument and evidence, right, for an ultimate origin, ultimate beginning of all physical entities. And in addition to the scientific evidence, we also have philosophical arguments. As I mentioned just now, there are at least 4 philosophical arguments, and I explained 2 of them just now, right? The arguments against an infinite regress, and the argument against traversing an actual infinite, right? So those arguments would prove that even if before the Big Bang there is something else, there couldn't be an infinite regress, right? So there must still be a first cause, right? No matter, even if there's something else before the Big Bang, right? There must still be a first event and be a first cause, right? So that's the second point. And the third point is that regardless of whether there's a Big Bang, or regardless of whether there's something else before the Big Bang or not, right? The Big Bang itself must still be fine-tuned, right? And Professor Kwan has already explained this, right? That the initial conditions of the explosion of our universe would still require an intelligent designer, right? In order to design the explosion in such a way that it can give rise to our universe, which is highly ordered, right? So regardless, so no matter what, so in any case, there must still be an intelligent creator, right? So given the 3 reasons I explained, right, the scientific evidence, the philosophical arguments, and the fine-tuning argument, we can be sure, we can conclude that there must still be an intelligent creator in any case. So there must.
I'm looking at some questions. Maybe for time's sake, I just take the initiative to answer the question from Bill C. Isaac.
Okay.
Now, the question is that the cosmological arguments need to cause a cause and probably also a powerful cause, but why should anyone jump from it to a more personal being? Now, my view is that to support the existence of a Christian God, we need also the cumulative arguments, which combine several arguments. And we may not be able to derive all the divine characteristics by just argument. Now, so one argument which is not discussed today is the moral argument, which I also support. The moral argument says that the best explanation for objective moral rules is that those moral rules are grounded in the divine nature, and the divine decrees which derive from the divine nature. So if this argument is correct, then the divine nature must be morally perfect. So if we add the moral argument to the several arguments mentioned today, then we do have a rational argument to support the perfectly moral nature of God. So I think we should have a more humble expectation of apologetics. We cannot solve everything by just one argument. We need to combine them together, and that provides a more satisfying case. And then there's a question about the reliance on scientific theories Now we know that the Big Bang theory may be displaced or disproved in the next century or maybe next week. But the idea is that apologetics is not eternal doctrines. God gave us wisdom. We need to provide the best apologetics, which is based on the best knowledge of that era. So apologetics can be revised according to the revision of the facts we know. But from the past history, my belief is that although the knowledge may be revised, but still, it seems that for all the facts we know, the best explanation or the most reasonable conclusion is still that God exists.
Thank you, Professor Kwan, for tackling those two questions asked by Karthik. Let me show another question. This is again to Professor Kwan. Sometimes as a teacher, we have to teach students about evolution. As a Christian, what approach should we take during such situation?
Okay, very good. Now, I think personally, first of all, it depends on the context. Now, if it is a more secular setting, then we need to be more careful because I'm not sure about the situation in India, but especially in the West or even in Hong Kong, that could be sensitive. So it is also different whether the class is a class on ethics or religion or ethics or a class on biology. So first of all, you need to be careful. I think we need to produce the best arguments in the appropriate setting. Now, for myself, I teach about evolution in a course on religion and modern science in Baptist University. Now, the students themselves are not Christians. Not all of them are Christians. Many are non-Christians. Now, so my approach is first of all, I don't want to corner them that either to believe in Christianity or drop the belief in evolution, because for them the choice is very easy. They just drop the religion. Now, so first of all, I make room for more perspective. So I try to argue that even for Christians, they may have different perspectives. So I try to argue that at least theoretically speaking, evolution and creation are not mutually exclusive, and there are different ways to combine them. Progressive creationism, theistic evolution, etc. I do not indicate which is the truth, but first of all, I make room for the thinking space to consider that. But then usually I would use some time to show that at least the current evolution theory can be divided into many parts. Perhaps concerning microevolution, all can agree that it is an established fact, and I would then raise doubt about those more speculative parts of the evolutionary theory, especially chemical evolution and macroevolution. As I mentioned briefly, I do think chemical evolution cannot stand up to scrutiny, and they do not, in fact, follow the scientific facts. But usually I use a more roundabout way just to explain the evolutionist theory and arguments and show that they're doubtful whether they can prove. And then I suggest the other way to look at that, and then the chemical explosion, etc. So I think I will try this approach. But for more Christian schools, say a theological seminary, I think there's room for arguing for a more definite position. Now, but that depends very much on your hermeneutics. Now, personally, I accept all earth theory because even I found among Christians there are either creationism, all earth, or progressive creationism, or theistic evolutionists. Personally, I think that progressive creationism is the best position, but that can include various levels of evolution, say within a group, because the Bible does not define a group. It may correspond to different levels of biological classification. So I do think a kind of a moderate and eutectic position may be the best because the data are very complex. Yeah.
A quick question again for you, Professor Kwan. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Regarding molecular machines, can these be seen using supermicroscope?
Not really, because you talk about now. I think they are constructed by, say, there may be some electron microscope, but still you cannot say cannot see the shape of the flagellum because they are really small. But they unravel their structure by, say, patterns of diffraction. There are many kinds of technique to unravel the structure of molecular machines. But I don't think nowadays we have one powerful microscope to really look at those molecules. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Kwan. One question for Dr. Loke from Dr. Belsi Isaac. He's asking, I have not read your book, but why have you entitled it A Novel Argument, God and Ultimate Origins? How do you develop on Craig's argument? After that, we go to questions related to problem of evil.
All right, so just now I mentioned that there are a number of arguments against an infinite past, and Craig usually defends the first two, right? The argument against concrete infinities and the argument against traversing an actual infinite. Now, in my book, I also defend these two and add more arguments to respond to Craig's critics, right? So people have criticized, some atheists have criticized Craig's on those two arguments, and I responded to those critics, right? So that is something in addition to what Craig has developed. And in addition to that, I offer a new argument, right? So just now so the argument against infinite causal regress. So just now you may have remember seeing the train cars, right? The train cars with a first train engine, right? So that is something new, right? That is something that Craig never defended before. So I came up with that argument actually. Actually, I used some Thomistic insight, right? This is actually from the Thomistic tradition, but I use it for the purpose of the Kalam actually. So that is something new, and that's why it's called a novel argument, right? So I added more arguments, right? And also responded to Craig's critics. So these are the new contributions in my book.
Thank you, Dr. Loke. Now let's look at some questions on the problem of evil, and Dr. Chan can address these. Why is the Bible full of violence?
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Now, in my presentation, I have not dealt with the specific cases of violence or evils in the Bible. Now, this is a very big topic, and there were genocides and all sorts of cost punishments, etc. in the Bible, and how could these commands from God be justified? Now, this is a very big topic, and
yeah, we can talk about it next time actually.
Yes, we can address this topic, and there are books, whole length books, book length treatments of this issue. For example, the book is God, a Moral Monster, written by Paul Copan, and according to these authors, they said that indeed we have many misunderstandings of the genocides that took place in the Exodus in Old Testament. This is the misunderstandings were due to the cultural gap. Okay, because those documents, the Old Testaments, they were written several thousand years ago, 3,000 years ago, in the Middle East, a culture wholly different from ours. So we must take into account the historical circumstances, the styles of writing, etc. So according to those authors, we have misunderstood. For example, for example, Jericho. God commanded the Israelites to wipe out Jericho's, killing all those inside. But historians told us that because of archaeological discoveries, Jericho indeed was a military fort. Okay, the population there indeed were not civilians; they were soldiers. Okay, and the civilians were living on the hillside rather than on the plain. So Jericho indeed was a military fort. So when God commands Israelites to kill everyone, including the old and the young, etc., this style of writing just means, according to, for example, Paul Copan, this style of writing just means that killing everyone inside. Okay, but Jericho, the majority of people living in Jericho indeed were soldiers. Okay, because that is a military fort. Okay, that is not a city for civilians to live. We need to understand clearly what happened. We must consider the historical circumstances, the styles of writing, how ancient people, ancient Israelites use language in writing those documents. So Paul Copan, in his book, pointed out that if we understand deeper into those documents, then we can find that many apparently terrible genocides indeed were not as we imagine. Okay, indeed, we have misunderstood a lot or those documents and what happened, what is recorded in those documents. So I think this is a very big topic and addressed by book-length treatments. So I suggest that we should find another occasion to address in details these ethical problems of the Old Testament. So if you are interested, you can take a look at the books written by Paul Copan. He is an outstanding analytic philosopher, and as far as I know, he has written at least 2 books to address those ethical problems in the Old Testament. For example, the book is God a Moral Monster? Another book is The God Command Genocides. Okay, so so you can consult those books, and I think we can, if there's an opportunity, we can arrange another occasion to discuss in details these cases of ethical problems. And another question, how could a loving God, all-knowing and all-powerful God allow evil? This question poses what is commonly called the problem of evil. The COVID-19 pandemic can force this question to the surface for many, with the suffering, death, and devastation. While many are safe so far by sheltering in place, others' lives are being threatened and ruined. How will I respond to this? Okay, now I think this is an existential question rather than a theoretical question. Okay, if we merely consider the question whether the existence of moral evils and sufferings in the world, whether their existence constitute a piece of cogent evidence that God does not exist, that is, an all-loving, all-powerful, and all-knowing God does not exist. And I think that I have shown that the existence of evil is not a piece of cogent evidence, which can show the non-existence of God. Okay, so theoretically speaking, I think the existence of evil does not constitute a problem with Christian theism. However, how should we face those people who are suffering? And I think, let me put it briefly in this way. I think if the suffering befall on me, okay, and of course I have experienced sufferings in the past, I would reason with myself. First, I will, for my own case, I will tell me that the existence of my sufferings is not, objectively speaking, is not a piece of good evidence that God does not exist or God is not all good. Okay, and this can be shown by logic. Okay, so I cannot use reason to argue against my faith. Okay, on the other hand, when I consider all the evidence for Christian theism, including Jesus' resurrection, fine-tuning argument, etc., okay, I will tell myself that I have very good reasons for thinking that Christian theism is true. Now, if I have good reasons for thinking that Christian theism is true, then of course I have good reason for thinking that God must have good reasons for allowing the sufferings to befall on me. So this is what reason tell me, This is what reason tell me. Okay, I use reason to tell myself that the most reasonable attitude towards my own suffering is that I can trust that most probably, God has good reasons to allow suffering, because I have good evidence for thinking that God exists and Christian theism is true. And if Christian theism is true, then an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God exists. And of course, if he exists, he must have good reasons for allowing the sufferings to befall on me. So in this way, I can persevere through the sufferings because I have hope. Amidst the sufferings, I have hope. I can believe that God has good reasons for allowing all this to happen on me. So in this way, I can be strengthened and to face the sufferings. So this is how I myself face the suffering befalling on me. But how about other people? I think that must be done case by case, right? Perhaps they need counseling. They need good Christians to be present with them, okay, to walk with them through the sufferings, to give them encouragement, to care for them and walk with them through the sufferings. So that's how we Christians can respond to other people's suffering. Okay, so I think Mother Teresa is an example, but for me myself, okay, I will face my own sufferings in that way. I think Christian apologetics is really helpful to my facing my own sufferings. Okay, it's really helpful for me. So for me, rationality and spirituality are closely related. Okay, and I do think that rationality, that is Christian apologetics, does enrich my spirituality, does help me to persevere through the difficulties of life. That's on my own case. Okay, but on how to face other people's sufferings, I think perhaps we need Christian counselors to help them facing their difficulties, etc. And does this guarantee by, okay, another question, the last two questions, does this guarantee by allowing evil, God can build moral traits? No, there's no guarantee, because ultimately we have free will, okay? It is we who ultimately decide how to respond to our suffering, how to respond to other people's suffering, as well as moral evils. So, so it is entirely possible that people would misuse their free will okay, and allow the sufferings to ruin their character or even ruin their Christian faith. This is something possible, and God, since He respects our autonomy, He respects our freedom, He allowed this happen. So soul making does not guarantee that those evils can build up our moral traits. And if a person is destroyed by evil and suffering, who is responsible for such catastrophe? So as I said, if sufferings ruin his moral character, since he has free will, he is to be responsible for his own choice. But how about those innocent people who are destroyed by natural evils, by for example tsunamis or earthquakes, or those innocent babies who were tortured to death by adults? Who is responsible for such catastrophe? Now, of course, we I would say that if the sufferings result from human misuse of free will, then of course it is those human beings who misuse their free will who are responsible for the sufferings inflicted on the victims. But how about those victims of natural evils? Now, I believe that, brothers and sisters, I believe that let me take an example. An innocent baby, okay, who is destroyed by earthquakes, for example. So I shall respond to this question in 2 points. The first point is that it is entirely possible that God has sufficient moral reasons, okay, to allow those things happen, okay. That is, let me put it this way: it is entirely possible that the sort of natural laws God created is already the best balance between good and sufferings. Okay, sufferings can bring about a lot of values. Okay, the allowing of suffering can bring about a lot of values, which could not occur, may well not be able to occur without any sufferings at all. So this is why this is a possible reason why God created a set of natural laws, the operation of which could bring about sufferings on human beings. And secondly, for those innocent victims who have not benefited from the suffering, for example, babies, okay, it is entirely possible that there is an afterlife, and God, I think, if there's an afterlife, then God can compensate for the losses of that innocent baby. Okay, so so I think that so in a word, there is no good reasons that a good God, an all good God, all powerful and all knowing God would not create such a nature such that it would, or the operation of its natural laws would bring about sufferings on human beings. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chan, for the beautiful exposition and answer to this question. Well, this is really a very intense and deep question, fundamental to not just Christianity, the world religions, and there are many requests that I can see for the PowerPoints, and some requests also for having a separate seminar on the topic problem of evil. Perhaps Dr. Loke and the team can decide about that. Perhaps we can think about something like that in the future.
And Dominic, may I respond briefly to the question I can see here?
Yeah.
How we can prove to a non-believer that in the suffering and struggling, that God has a good plan for us. Okay, I would like to respond briefly. Okay, if we so here you are using the word proof. Okay. That is, here the question is a theoretical question, okay, not an existential question. So I think a proof will go in this way, okay, two parts, okay. Indeed, what has been done in our conference. The first part consists of positive reasons for the existence of God, okay, positive evidence for the existence of God. And the second part consists in replying to the objections to the existence of God. For example, the existence of evil, pointing out that the existence of evil is, logically speaking, is not a piece of cogent evidence which can show that there is no God. So after we have considered all this evidence, we can show that very probably that there is a God, that Jesus is God. Okay, so if there is a God, since God by definition is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all good, then of course that he must have a good reason, he must have a good plan, or he must have good reasons for allowing the existence of sufferings and difficulties. So I think this is a quite reasonable way to respond to that question. If we have good evidence to show that God exists, okay, then we have good evidence to show that God has good reasons to allow suffering. Okay, since by definition he is all good, right? So he must have good reasons. And in fact, we have good evidence as presented in today's conference. We have good evidence. Okay, we have positive reasons, and we have answers to negative objections. So we have good reasons for thinking that God exists. Therefore, we have good reasons for thinking that the God that exists must have good reasons for allowing the occurrence of suffering.
Can I join the discussion? Can I join the discussion here?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I think
Sure.
for a person in difficult times, how to prove that God has a plan for him, I think apart from the theoretical arguments by Dr. Chen, I think it is very important to, first of all, to show that there is no need of proof, because life is an adventure. We need possibilities and hope more than a proof. So I think we need to show the people that, first of all, it is unreasonable to demand a proof, but you should not be pessimistic. You should be open to possibilities that you may not have thought about, and then how to show the possibilities by examples. If something is real, then it is possible. So for people who are suffering, I think the best way, first of all, is to help him, to encourage him, so that he can be more open to positive possibilities. And the second is to share with him good stories, some biographies. In fact, there are many people who have suffered immensely, but they can still they can still find a way out. They can still look for the meaning of life. One of my favorite examples is Viktor Frankl. He has a book on the meaning of life, which shares about his experience in a Nazi concentration camp. Now, And then for the person, I think I think we need to persuade him that if a person suffering in such a condition can still have hope and develop his future career and learn from his immense suffering, then you should also be able to do that. And we should give him a positive thinking that despite all these difficult experiences, you have positive potential. So you should look, first of all, you should be open to the plan of God. And there are many possibilities which can be demonstrated from so many different stories of people who have undergone all these sufferings, but still are not broken. And then they can still move forward and also be a blessing to other people. I think these concrete examples can also be quite helpful. Now, concerning the other question about what about people destroyed by massive suffering, I think we need to distinguish that I agree with Dr. Chan's point that even when facing suffering, there are parts due to our own free will, our choices. Secondly, but human potential is limited. So I think maybe the question is about those who we feel that they are under such a great burden of suffering that their destruction, no matter physical or moral, seems to be understandable. Now, in this case, I think we need to say that for the God we know, He's loving, and now even if you fail this time, say you fail a test this time, you can still learn and improve yourself and get an A in the next test. Now, for if we consider the physical destruction, then certainly God can restore that person to life. If we're talking about moral destruction, then we believe that God's grace is always possible to help us reform our moral personality, as long as we are open to receive His grace. So no matter how a man is destroyed by the suffering, he still has hope, because the grace is always on offer. Everyone can count on that, because God's love is unchanging. So these are a few perspectives that I want to offer to respond to that. I think very sensible question here. I think for Christians, we should not be too dogmatic and too judgmental. There are indeed cases when people crumbled under very severe situations, and then maybe it's not their responsibilities. We may consider our wife battered every day by a violent husband, forced to become insane and become violent and so on. I think these stories do happen in our world, and in that case, we should not hold the victims responsible. We should hold the husband, those who harm other people, responsible. And then for the victims, we should hold out and encourage them to be open to new possibilities in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Chan and Professor.
Yeah, let me also add something very quickly.
Yep.
So in addition to what Dr. Kayan has said, right, God has given us evidence that He exists, right, through creation and also through His resurrection. I think God also given us evidence of His love, right, because this God who resurrected from the dead also died for us, for our sins. I mean, He sacrificed for us on the cross. I mean, the cross is such an amazing demonstration of God's love, right? But God demonstrates His own love for us. God demonstrates His own love for us in that where we are still sinners, Christ died for us, right? So this is how God proves His love for us. And because we know that God loves us so much, we know that He must have a good purpose, right, for allowing us to go through suffering. Right? So I think the cross, right, is the answer, right, to this question. And I think God demonstrates His love, right? His infinite love. I mean, it's really amazing, right, to think that the creator of the universe, so awesome, will be willing to come down to our tiny planet and to die for us, for our sins. I mean, this is an astonishing love, right? Amazing, infinite love, right? So we have such a loving God, and we should give thanks. And because of His love and His resurrection, right, this will give us strength to go through any suffering that we face in life.
Right.
So
So we have not just a theoretical and logical answer, but also psychological and, of course, spiritual answers to this tremendous question. Of course, we have jumped over the limit of time that we have set, but it's time to wrap up this conference. Exciting. Some have already left because they had other engagements, but let me invite Reverend Jayant Chinchani from Central India Theological Seminary. He's the vice principal, and he will give the vote of thanks in short.
Okay. Here in India, it's morning. So good morning to all of you. And I take this opportunity on behalf of Central India Theological Seminary, Italy, India, just to thank all the panels for their beautiful presentation. First of all, we wanted to thank Dr. Andrew Luke for presenting a couple of topics which were very enriching for us. The first one was to do with the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God, which was thoughtful presentation, well researched, and we as a group of faculty member and also our postgraduate students are really blessed with your presentation. Of course, the second one was investigation of the resurrections of Jesus Christ. Was a really good one, and we enjoyed, and you were able to give us both biblical and extra biblical evidences for the resurrections of Jesus Christ. So once again, thank you, Dr. Andrew Luke, for giving us such a thoughtful presentation. And we as a CITS community, we were really blessed. And I like to thank again to Professor Kwan for giving us key evidences for intelligence design in relation to the existence of God. And it was really interesting, and you were able to explain to us in detail, and we are very much thankful to you, sir. And also you were able to answer some of the questions that was put before you. So we really enjoyed, and we want to thank you. And of course, we will keep expecting even the days to come to have more of you in this level, in this way. And we also want to thank Dr. Chan. He presented to us about the problem of good and evil. You were dare enough to take up this issue. Of course, it's a more complex, but at the same time, you were able to answer our questions. And we want to thank you, sir, for taking time to explain to us. And at the last but not the least, our good friend and our provost, Dr. Dominic, for organizing this beautiful seminar, a seminar which has a more of a meaning to it, and we thoroughly enjoyed. And it was an eye-opening experience for us for many issues that we face in India. And we as a biblical teacher or teaching the word of God, we have many challenges. But the presentation that you gave to us today was an eye-opening for many of us, if not all of us. We really learned a lot from you. So on behalf of Central India Theological Seminary, Itarsi in Madhya Pradesh, we want to thank you. And of course, there is another person by name Luther Lee was also able to respond to some of the question that was there. And we thank you, sir, for your efforts and your responses, which were very helpful for us. So we also want to thank all the participants, and we enjoy this beautiful virtual seminar for us. And thank you once again, and may God bless all of you. Thank you, sir.
Now I would like to invite Bishop Joseph Hivale. He is the Bishop of Koinonia Fellowship of Pastors, as well as the President of Koinonia College of Theology, as an 88 theological center in Pune, close to Mumbai. So I invite you, sir, to close this conference with prayer.
Thank you, Dr. Dominic, for organizing this conference for the benefit of our Indian theologians. We are so thankful to you and your team of speakers. Let me pray to conclude this conference. Loving Father, we are so thankful to you for bringing us together to listen this wonderful truth, and all the four subjects and the four speakers, those who have explained, imparted the knowledge for our benefit. We submit ourselves into the hand and we pray for all the participants, those who have very great interest in listening these speakers, whatever participated, whatever is imparted to us. We are so thankful to you, Lord. Bless each and everyone and bless the organizers of this conference. I just pray in the name of Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. God bless you.
Thank you so much. Right.
Thank you very much. Thank
Praise
you,
the Lord.
everyone. Thank you, Dr.
Okay, thanks to all the participants for your patience. Almost 4 hours. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Okay, God bless. Bye. Yes.